Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight, we settle into a story that has travelled quietly through centuries of forgotten manuscripts, marginal notes, and half-preserved traditions. A story that does not announce itself loudly and does not ask for belief or disbelief, but simply waits to be listened to with patience. This is a history that sits at the edge of myth and memory, not rushing forward, not insisting on interpretation, but unfolding at its own pace, as many ancient stories once did when they were spoken softly rather than proclaimed. In the long span of human storytelling, there are certain names that never fully disappear. They linger in fragments, in side passages, in texts that were copied and recopied even after they were declared unimportant, dangerous, or unnecessary. Samyaza is one of those names, not shouted, not celebrated, not carved into monuments, but carried forward quietly, almost reluctantly, by scribes who seemed unsure whether the memory itself was meant to survive. He's not presented as a hero, and not quite as a villain either. Instead, he appears as a figure of consequence, someone whose actions altered the human condition in ways that could not be undone, even after he himself was removed from the world. This story does not begin with rebellion or punishment. It begins much earlier, in a worldview where the boundary between heaven and earth was understood differently than it is now, a time when oversight did not imply distance, and when the idea of divine presence did not automatically mean intervention through disaster or miracle. The Watchers, as they are remembered in later traditions, were not originally framed as transgressors. They were part of a system, a structure meant to observe, to maintain order, to ensure continuity between realms that were believed to be connected by design rather than separated by force. Samyaza emerges within this framework not as an outsider, but as a leader among beings whose role was already defined. His authority did not come from defiance, but from position. The texts that mention him, sparse as they are, suggest someone who carried responsibility before he carried blame, and that distinction matters because it changes how the story unfolds. What follows is not the tale of a sudden fall, but of gradual involvement. Not a moment of impulse, but a series of choices made within a system that allowed those choices to matter. As with many ancient narratives, the most significant changes occur quietly. There is no single line where the world shifts and announces that it has become something new. Instead, small adjustments accumulate. Knowledge is shared. Boundaries soften. Roles blur. Humanity, which had once existed within narrow parameters, begins to expand in unexpected directions. Tools become more precise. Understanding deepens. Social structures evolve faster than the systems meant to contain them. None of this is framed as corruption in its earliest descriptions. It is described as learning, as growth, as development that simply moved too quickly to remain stable. This is why Samyaza's name remains attached to transformation rather than destruction. The traditions that preserve him do not accuse him of wiping out humanity or attempting to rule it. They associate him with teaching, with exposure, with the consequences that follow when information arrives before the structures needed to support it. In these accounts, humanity does not collapse because it is punished. It destabilizes because it changes too fast, absorbing knowledge without the restraint that long adaptation usually provides. Before continuing further, it is worth pausing briefly, not to break the flow, but to settle into the rhythm of the night. If you find this atmosphere calming, if this style of slow, careful exploration fits into your quiet hours, you can support the channel in simple ways. A like, a subscription, or simply letting the video play through helps this kind of long-form storytelling continue. Nothing more is required. The story itself remains unchanged either way. From here, the narrative moves backward rather than forward. To understand what Samyaza altered, it becomes necessary to understand the world as it was before his name appeared in surviving texts. A world where humanity existed with limits that were not yet tested. a world where oversight did not mean control, and where observation did not yet carry the risk of involvement. The earliest layers of tradition describe a human population that was capable but restrained, skilled but narrow in scope, intelligent but dependent on slow accumulation rather than sudden transmission. In this earlier framework, knowledge was not assumed to be neutral. It was understood as weight, something that required balance. Certain crafts were associated with stability, others with disruption. Metallurgy, for example, appears in later texts not merely as a technological development, but as a turning point that altered social hierarchies, warfare, and resource control. Writing itself, while celebrated, was also treated cautiously, framed as a gift that carried responsibility. These attitudes suggest a worldview deeply aware that information reshapes behaviour long before it reshapes belief. The Watchers were positioned within this system as observers precisely because observation creates distance. To watch is not to act. To see is not to intervene. This separation was not arbitrary, it was foundational. The texts imply that as long as that boundary remained intact, the world retained its balance. Humanity progressed slowly. The divine realm remained ordered. Oversight functioned as intended. Samyaza's importance lies in the moment when this arrangement began to loosen, not through violence or defiance, but through proximity. Leadership among the Watchers did not imply command over humanity. It implied coordination among those tasked with observation. Samyaza's role, as later traditions remember it, involved consensus, responsibility, and the management of risk. This is where the story becomes less about transgression and more about escalation. Once involvement began, withdrawal became increasingly difficult. Teaching led to further teaching. Explanation invited imitation. Guidance turned into reliance. Humanity, once exposed to accelerated knowledge, did not simply absorb it passively. It reorganized around it. Social structures adapted. Power consolidated. Skills that once took generations to refine appeared rapidly. This compression of development created stress within systems that were never designed for such speed. The result was not immediate chaos, but long-term imbalance. Growth without containment. Expansion without correction. What later traditions call judgment appears only after these effects are already established. The emphasis in earlier layers is not on punishment, but on containment, on limiting further destabilization, on restoring separation rather than erasing what had already occurred. Samyaza's fate, as it is remembered, reflects this shift. He is not destroyed, he is removed, isolated, prevented from further influence. His story does not end. It is suspended. This suspension mirrors the broader narrative arc. Humanity continues, altered but intact. Knowledge remains, unevenly distributed and imperfectly understood. The Watchers fade from direct presence, but not from memory. Their influence persists indirectly, embedded in practices, myths, and unexplained accelerations in human capability. Samyaza becomes less a figure of action and more a reference point, a marker indicating where the trajectory changed. As this account continues, the focus will move steadily from framework to event, from structure to consequence. The world before the Watchers were named provides the necessary ground for understanding why their involvement mattered at all. Nothing in this tradition exists in isolation. Each development builds upon what came before, often without clear intention, often without awareness of the eventual outcome. For now, the narrative remains at its beginning. The conditions are established but not yet tested. Authority exists, but has not yet been challenged by circumstance. Humanity stands on the edge of transformation without recognizing it as such. And Samyaza, still unnamed in the earliest layers, occupies a role that will soon carry more weight than it was ever meant to bear, as the story continues to unfold without pause. Long before any name like Watcher entered written memory, before later traditions tried to organise the past into clear roles and titles, the world was understood as something quieter, slower, and far less divided than it would later become. The earliest layers of tradition do not describe a sharp boundary between realms, nor do they insist on constant divine supervision or dramatic intervention. Instead, they present a world that functioned according to order, continuity and restraint, where existence unfolded according to rhythms that were accepted rather than challenged. Humanity in these early conceptions was neither insignificant nor dominant. People lived within limits that were not experienced as oppression, but as the natural shape of existence. Communities formed, dissolved and reformed without the expectation of permanence. Knowledge accumulated gradually, passed from one generation to the next through imitation, memory and careful instruction. There was no sense that everything must be known, or that mastery over nature was an achievable goal. Survival depended on attentiveness rather than control, on reading patterns rather than reshaping them. The world itself was perceived as layered, but not fractured. The sky was above, the earth below, and life moved between them without constant interference. Forces beyond human reach were acknowledged, but not personalized in the way later traditions would emphasize. Storms, seasons, fertility and decay were experienced as realities rather than messages. They carried meaning, but not always intention. This distinction mattered. It meant that existence did not revolve around appeasing unseen powers through fear alone, but around maintaining harmony through balance and repetition. In this context, oversight existed as a concept without identity. There was an assumption that the world was observed, that order was maintained by principles beyond human action, but those principles were not yet embodied as named beings with individual wills. Observation did not imply judgment. It did not imply interference. It implied continuity, the idea that the structure of the world was upheld even when no one was actively shaping it. The absence of named overseers is not an oversight in the texts. It is a reflection of how early societies understood stability. When things function as expected, they do not demand explanation. The sun rises, the rivers flow, crops grow or fail, according to patterns that are understood through experience rather than theology. Only when disruption occurs does the need for narrative intensify. Only when balance falters does memory begin to search for causes rather than cycles. This early world was not innocent, nor was it idealized as free from hardship. Life was precarious. Illness, scarcity, and death were constant companions, but hardship was not interpreted as punishment. It was a condition of existence. The human response was adaptation, not accusation. Communities adjusted, migrated, diversified practices. They did not yet frame suffering as evidence of moral failure or divine displeasure. Knowledge during this period was practical and bounded. Skills related to hunting, gathering, early cultivation, shelter building and tool-making developed incrementally. Each improvement emerged from repeated effort rather than sudden revelation. There was respect for skill, but no obsession with innovation for its own sake. Change occurred when necessity demanded it, not because possibility invited it. The later fascination with forbidden knowledge would have seemed foreign in this earlier framework. Information was not divided into permitted and prohibited categories. It was limited by access and experience. What could not be known simply remained unknown. There was no urgency to pierce boundaries that had not yet been perceived as barriers. Social structures reflected this restraint. Authority existed, but it was localized and temporary. Leadership was situational, tied to age, experience, or circumstance rather than permanent hierarchy. Decisions emerged from communal memory as much as individual insight. There was little sense that power could or should be centralized beyond immediate need. In this setting, the idea of beings tasked specifically with watching humanity had not yet taken form. Observation was implicit rather than assigned. The world did not require named guardians because it was not yet understood as unstable. Order was assumed, not enforced. Continuity was expected, not managed. it is important to recognize that the absence of names does not indicate absence of presence. Rather, it reflects a stage of understanding where presence did not require identity. Forces were felt without being personified. Influence existed without narrative. The later act of naming the Watchers signals a shift in perception, rather than a sudden appearance of new beings. As human societies grew more complex, as settlements became more permanent and interactions more layered, the old assumptions began to strain. Patterns that once held no longer explained emerging realities. Population density increased, resource management became more intricate, social tensions multiplied. The slow rhythms of earlier existence began to accelerate, and with that acceleration came uncertainty. It is in this transitional pressure that memory begins to reorganize itself. Stories emerge not merely to entertain or explain, but to stabilize understanding. Roles are assigned where none were previously articulated. Observation becomes oversight. Presence becomes authority. Continuity becomes responsibility. The world before the Watchers were named was not a blank slate waiting for intervention. It was a functioning system operating within parameters that were adequate for its time. What changed was not the existence of oversight, but the human awareness of it. As societies reached beyond earlier limits, the need to explain consequence intensified. When outcomes could no longer be attributed solely to chance or cycle, intention was introduced. This is where naming becomes significant. To name is to define. To define is to assign role, expectation, and accountability. The Watchers emerge in memory precisely when humanity begins to feel watched. Not because observation suddenly begins, but because actions begin to carry consequences that extend beyond immediate experience. The early texts and traditions preserve traces of this shift without dramatizing it. There is no sudden declaration that Watchers descend or arrive. Instead, references appear gradually. Hints of beings who observe, who are present without belonging fully to the human world. The language remains tentative, as though the idea itself is still forming. This hesitancy suggests that the concept of the Watchers was not imported fully formed, but evolved alongside changes in human behavior. As communities experimented with new technologies, new forms of organization, and new ways of exerting control over their environment, the sense of being observed sharpened. Accountability extended beyond the visible community to an unseen order that was assumed to be aware of imbalance. Samyaza's later emergence must be understood against this backdrop. His role becomes significant only because the world has already shifted away from its earlier equilibrium. Without this transformation, leadership among observers would have remained irrelevant. There would have been nothing to manage, nothing to restrain, nothing to correct. The early world did not need intervention because it did not yet challenge its own limits. It moved within boundaries that were understood instinctively. The moment those boundaries began to blur, the structure of oversight required articulation. The Watchers were named because restraint was no longer automatic. This period is often overlooked in favour of more dramatic accounts of dissent, teaching, and punishment. But without understanding this earlier state, the later narrative loses coherence. The actions attributed to Samyaza and those associated with him do not occur in a vacuum. They arise from a system that is already under strain. Humanity's gradual movement toward complexity created conditions where observation could no longer remain passive. Knowledge accumulated faster, influence spread wider, individual actions began to shape collective outcomes in lasting ways. The old balance held, but with increasing effort. The world before the Watchers were named was not unaware. It was simply unpressured. It did not demand explanation for every outcome, nor did it seek meaning beyond survival and continuity. That simplicity, once lost, could not be recovered. The naming of the Watchers marks the point where humanity begins to recognize that growth carries cost, and that oversight, once implicit, now requires form. From this foundation, the story moves naturally toward the heavens not as a place of sudden rebellion, but as a realm drawn gradually closer by human change. The silence above was not broken by intrusion, but by attention. And as attention intensified, names followed, roles solidified, and responsibility began to concentrate, setting the stage for Samyaza to emerge not as an anomaly, but as a consequence of a world that was no longer content to remain as it had been. In the earliest traditions that survive only as fragments, echoes, and later reconstructions, the heavens are never described as empty or indifferent. They are present without being loud, active without constant display. Silence, in the modern sense of absence or inactivity, is not how the ancient world understood the sky above. Instead, the heavens were perceived as ordered, attentive, and continuous, operating according to principles that did not require constant announcement to be felt. To say the heavens were not silent does not mean they were filled with voices, commands, or constant intervention. It means they were understood as engaged. The movement of stars, the regularity of cycles, the predictability of seasons all suggested intention without speech. Order itself was the message. In worlds where survival depended on reading subtle changes in environment, silence was not emptiness. It was information that had to be learned slowly. The sky served as the most reliable reference point for early societies. Long before writing systems stabilized memory, patterns in the heavens offered consistency. The rising and setting of celestial bodies marked time. The shifting positions of stars guided migration, planting, and ritual. These patterns were not random. Their reliability implied structure. Structure implied maintenance. Maintenance implied presence, even if that presence was never named. Early traditions reflect this understanding by avoiding dramatic descriptions of divine speech. The heavens do not shout. They indicate. They do not argue. They continue. This continuity was reassuring, but it also carried weight. A system that persists without interruption suggests oversight rather than accident. The absence of silence in this sense is the absence of chaos. It is important to recognize that early cultures did not experience the cosmos as distant. The sky was close, not physically, but psychologically. It influenced daily life in ways that could not be ignored. Rainfall patterns, seasonal shifts, eclipses, and unusual celestial events were not curiosities. They were signals, not necessarily messages with explicit meaning, but indications that the system responded to internal rules. This perception shaped how early societies thought about responsibility. If the heavens reflected order, then disorder on Earth required explanation. When crops failed repeatedly, when floods came unexpectedly, when disease spread beyond familiar patterns, the assumption was not randomness, but imbalance. Something had shifted. Something had been disturbed. The heavens were therefore not silent witnesses. They were benchmarks. When harmony existed, their patterns reinforced confidence in continuity. When disruption occurred, their unchanged cycles emphasized contrast. The sky remained ordered while life below faltered. This disparity demanded interpretation. In these early layers of thought, explanation did not immediately take the form of moral judgment. Failure was not always punishment. Instead, imbalance suggested misalignment. Actions no longer fit the structure that governed the world. The heavens, by continuing unchanged, highlighted this misalignment without commenting on it. This is where the concept of oversight begins to take shape, not oversight as surveillance, but as framework. The idea that the world operated within parameters that could be exceeded. That human activity, while significant, existed within a larger system that did not adjust itself endlessly to accommodate expansion. The heavens were not silent because they did not need to speak. Their constancy communicated limits. Early traditions reflect a deep awareness that stability does not negotiate. It persists until disrupted, and when disruption occurs, the response is consequence rather than conversation. This understanding predates named beings, councils, or hierarchies. It is structural rather than personal. The sky does not intervene, it remains. And in remaining unchanged, it reveals change elsewhere. As human societies grew more complex, this relationship intensified. Agriculture tied survival to seasonal regularity. Permanent settlements increased dependence on predictability. Trade expanded the consequences of failure beyond individual groups. In this environment, celestial order became increasingly central to planning and survival. The heavens were consulted not for instruction, but for alignment. Calendars emerged. Observational practices became refined. Priesthoods formed not to command the sky, but to interpret it. These interpreters did not claim to alter celestial patterns. They claimed to read them correctly. This distinction matters. The heavens were authoritative not because they issued commands, but because they demonstrated reliability. Authority emerged from consistency. A system that never faltered did not require enforcement. Its influence was internalized. When later traditions speak of heavenly beings, councils, or watchers, they are not inventing presence. They are translating structure into narrative. The sky had always mattered. The language simply evolved. The silence of the heavens in later interpretation became associated with distance or withdrawal. But in the earliest framework, silence meant equilibrium. Noise implied instability. Intervention implied failure. A silent heaven was functioning as intended. This helps explain why early traditions do not describe constant divine correction. Correction occurs only when imbalance exceeds tolerance. The heavens remain unchanged until change becomes unsustainable. In this light, the later emergence of watchers does not represent a sudden interest in humanity. It represents a response to human acceleration. When societies expanded faster than inherited systems could support, oversight required articulation. The heavens were not silent because they were always present as reference. They did not need to intrude until human activity created dissonance too large to ignore. The silence ends not because the sky changes, but because humanity does. This is reflected in the way early texts frame causality. Events are rarely described as arbitrary. Even disasters are contextualized. Floods follow accumulation. Collapse follows excess. Intervention follows imbalance. The heavens observe not out of curiosity but necessity. Observation becomes relevant when systems approach limits. Before that, presence remains implicit. Samyaza's later role must be understood within this continuum. He does not introduce awareness. He embodies response. His leadership emerges in a moment when observation alone is no longer sufficient, when the system requires mediation rather than mere continuity. The heavens were not silent because they were never detached. Their order defined expectation. Their persistence shaped planning. Their refusal to adapt endlessly established boundaries. Early humanity did not imagine a universe eager to interfere. It imagined one that endured. Endurance, when paired with human change, eventually produces friction. That friction demanded explanation, then narrative, then identity. Naming watchers was not the beginning of oversight. It was the recognition that oversight had become active. The heavens had always mattered. They simply had not yet been challenged. As the story continues, the transition from silent structure to articulated presence becomes unavoidable. What was once maintained through balance now requires decision. What was once implicit now demands form. And in that shift, figures like Samyaza move from abstraction to consequence, as the world enters a phase where the heavens are no longer merely observed, but involved. When later traditions describe the watchers, they often do so through the lens of consequence rather than origin. By the time their names are recorded, by the time their actions are framed as dangerous or transgressive, the outcome has already shaped interpretation. What is lost in this retrospective view is the original function these beings were believed to serve. In the earliest conceptual layers, The Watchers are not defined by rebellion. They are defined by responsibility. The role of overseer implies structure, not defiance. It assumes an existing order that requires maintenance rather than overthrow. Oversight exists precisely because a system is valued, because continuity matters enough to be preserved. In this sense, the Watchers emerge not as challengers to authority, but as extensions of it, tasked with ensuring that boundaries hold and processes continue as intended. The language used in early traditions reinforces this understanding. The Watchers are associated with seeing, knowing, and remaining present, not with conquest or domination. Observation is their defining feature. They do not create humanity, nor do they rule it. They witness its development within a framework that assumes gradual progression, rather than sudden transformation. This distinction is essential. A rebel acts against an established order with the intent to replace or subvert it. An overseer operates within that order, accepting its legitimacy even while navigating its complexities. The Watchers, as they are initially framed, belong firmly in the second category. Their authority is delegated, not seized. Their presence is functional, not aspirational. Oversight becomes necessary when systems reach a level of complexity where self-regulation is no longer sufficient. As human societies expanded beyond small mobile groups into settled communities with accumulated surplus, social stratification, and emerging technologies, the margin for imbalance widened. Actions carried consequences that extended beyond immediate experience. Decisions echoed across generations. In this environment, observation took on greater weight. To see was no longer passive. To know carried responsibility. The Watchers are introduced at precisely this threshold, where awareness and consequence begin to align. It is significant that the earliest traditions do not describe the Watchers as acting independently. They appear within a hierarchy, accountable to a broader structure that remains largely unnamed but clearly assumed. Their oversight is not autonomous. It exists within limits. This hierarchical framing challenges later interpretations that portray the Watchers as rogue agents acting on impulse. Such portrayals flatten a much more nuanced understanding. The early texts suggest tension, not insurrection. Difficulty, not defiance. The Watchers observe humanity not because they desire control, but because unchecked development threatens stability. Oversight is preventative, not punitive. It is meant to preserve balance, not impose dominance. This becomes clearer when examining what oversight actually entails. Watching is not intervening. Knowing is not acting. The Watchers are present without being intrusive, aware without being directive. Their role mirrors the earlier conception of the heavens themselves, structured, attentive, and largely silent. The shift occurs when observation alone becomes insufficient. As human activity accelerates, as innovation outpaces inherited constraints, oversight encounters a dilemma. To remain passive risks collapse. To intervene risks contamination. This is the space where later traditions place Samyaza, not as a rebel seeking chaos, but as a leader navigating an unsolvable problem. How does one preserve order without becoming part of the system one is meant to oversee? The framing of rebellion emerges only after outcomes are known. Once the consequences of involvement manifest, narratives retroactively assign intent. Actions that were once framed as guidance are recast as transgression. Authority becomes blame. But the original function matters. The Watchers are not described as opposing divine order. They are described as failing to maintain it through restraint. The failure is one of proximity, not ideology. This distinction reshapes how their actions are understood. Teaching humanity is not initially portrayed as forbidden. It becomes forbidden when its effects destabilize the balance it was meant to support. The prohibition arises from consequence, not from intrinsic wrongdoing. Early oversight assumes humanity can absorb knowledge at a controlled pace. It assumes learning occurs within cultural buffers that mitigate disruption. When these assumptions prove false, the role of overseer becomes compromised. The Watchers did not arrive intending to change humanity forever. They became agents of change by remaining present when withdrawal would have preserved equilibrium. Their mistake lies not in rebellion, but in underestimating acceleration. Oversight requires distance. Proximity erodes objectivity. The Watcher's continued presence among humans narrows the gap between observer and participant. Authority blurs into involvement. This process unfolds gradually. There is no single act of defiance. Instead, a series of small allowances accumulate. Explanation follows curiosity. Guidance follows confusion. Teaching follows reliance. At no point does the narrative suggest a conscious decision to overthrow order. Instead, it depicts an erosion of boundaries through sustained interaction. The Watchers adapt to human context, and in doing so, lose the distance that defined their role. Later traditions struggle with this ambiguity. Rebellion offers a cleaner narrative. It assigns blame clearly and restores hierarchy decisively. But it oversimplifies a process that was fundamentally gradual and structural. Understanding the Watchers as overseers rather than rebels preserves the internal logic of the earliest traditions. It explains why their punishment takes the form it does. They are not annihilated. They are removed, restrained, separated. This response aligns with correction rather than retaliation. The goal is to restore boundaries, not to exact vengeance. Oversight failed because proximity persisted too long. The solution is distance, not destruction. Samyaza's leadership becomes critical here. As an overseer among overseers, his responsibility was not merely to observe humanity, but to manage the observers themselves. His failure is collective, not personal. He does not act alone. He represents a threshold where oversight becomes unsustainable. The narrative emphasis on oaths and collective decisions in later chapters reinforces this interpretation. Rebellion implies individual ambition. Oaths imply shared burden. The Watchers bind themselves because the decision to remain involved is not taken lightly. This collective framing undermines the idea of spontaneous revolt. It suggests deliberation, concern, and awareness of risk. The Watchers understand that involvement carries consequence. They proceed anyway, not out of defiance, but out of perceived necessity. The world they oversee is changing faster than inherited structures can manage. Oversight without guidance risks collapse. Guidance without restraint risks transformation. The Watchers choose the latter, believing intervention can stabilize rather than disrupt. They are wrong, but not reckless. Their miscalculation lies in assuming that knowledge can be transferred without fundamentally altering social trajectories. Once knowledge enters a system, it reshapes power, hierarchy, and expectation. Humanity does not merely learn, it reorganizes. Skills become leverage. Information becomes authority. Inequality widens. Violence intensifies. Growth becomes uncontained. These outcomes retroactively define the Watchers as rebels because rebellion is easier to name than systemic failure. But the texts themselves preserve hints of a more complicated reality. Responsibility precedes guilt. Oversight precedes violation. This framing also explains why humanity is not destroyed alongside the Watchers. If the error were rebellion against divine order, collective punishment would follow. Instead, humanity continues, altered but intact. The correction targets the overseers, not the observed. The Watchers are removed because oversight must be restored to its original distance. Humanity must now navigate the consequences of accelerated development without further external input. This withdrawal does not erase what has already occurred. Knowledge cannot be unlearned. Structures cannot be unbuilt. The world moves forward carrying the imprint of intervention. The Watchers as overseers, not rebels, leaves humanity with inheritance rather than condemnation. What changed humanity forever was not defiance, but exposure, not revolt, but proximity. As the narrative moves forward, this distinction becomes increasingly important. Samyaza's role cannot be understood through the language of rebellion alone. His leadership exists within a system that failed under strain, not because it opposed order, because it could not preserve it unchanged. The story continues not toward a clash of wills, but toward a reckoning with consequence. Oversight becomes intervention. Intervention becomes imbalance. Imbalance demands correction. And in that progression, the Watchers pass from silent presence to remembered actors, not because they sought to overturn the world, but because they stayed long enough to change it. Among the Watchers, authority was never meant to resemble rulership in the human sense. It was not established through dominance, inheritance, or force. It existed as coordination, as shared responsibility distributed among those tasked with observation. Samyaza's position within this structure becomes significant not because he sought power, but because authority, once required, had to settle somewhere. And in systems built on restraint rather than command, the emergence of leadership already signals that something has begun to shift. The earliest traditions that preserve Samyaza's name do not describe his rise. They do not recount ambition, rivalry, or contest. His authority appears as a given, assumed rather than explained. This absence of origin is telling. It suggests that leadership among the Watchers was not achieved through disruption, but recognized through circumstance. When coordination became necessary, someone had to speak to decide to carry the weight of collective consequence. Samyaza becomes visible at precisely that moment. Before this point, the Watchers functioned as a distributed presence. Observation did not require hierarchy. Each fulfilled the same purpose, operating within the same boundaries. Authority was implicit in the system itself rather than vested in individuals. But as the world below changed, observation became uneven. Some regions transformed faster than others. Some human communities accumulated knowledge, power, and complexity at rates that strained inherited balance. The Watchers could no longer remain interchangeable. Decisions began to matter. Authority among them did not emerge to command humanity, but to regulate themselves. This is a critical distinction. Samyaza's leadership addresses internal coherence, not external domination. His role is less about what humans do, and more about how the Watchers respond to what humans are becoming. The question of authority arises when restraint fails to be automatic, when boundaries require reinforcement rather than assumption. Samyaza stands at this threshold. His presence signals that observation alone no longer suffices. Oversight now involves deliberation. Deliberation implies risk. Once a group discusses action, inaction becomes a choice rather than default. Responsibility crystallizes. Outcomes can be traced. Authority becomes visible, because accountability becomes unavoidable. The traditions do not portray Samyaza as issuing commands unilaterally. Instead, they emphasize collective agreement. Decisions are framed as shared. Oaths are taken together. This collective language matters. It implies that authority among the Watchers was not absolute. Samyaza did not rule. He convened. His influence likely rested on experience, proximity, or clarity, rather than formal rank. He is remembered because he articulates the problem others already perceive. The human world is no longer passive. Knowledge is spreading unevenly. Power is consolidating. Violence is intensifying. The balance that oversight was meant to preserve is deteriorating. In this context, authority is not a prize. It is a burden. Samyaza's role emerges because someone must bear responsibility for whatever follows. Silence is no longer neutral. Withdrawal now carries consequence just as intervention does. The Watchers face a dilemma without precedent. Their mandate assumed gradual change. Humanity's acceleration disrupts that assumption. If they remain distant, instability grows unchecked. If they intervene, they alter the trajectory they are meant to preserve. Authority becomes necessary because ambiguity becomes unsustainable. Samyaza's leadership addresses this ambiguity. He becomes the point around which deliberation stabilizes. Later traditions often simplify this moment by framing it as temptation or rebellion. But the language of the earliest accounts resists that interpretation. There is no suggestion that Samyaza seeks to elevate himself. His authority does not challenge the larger order. It responds to strain within it. This is why his leadership is remembered rather than erased. Names endure when they carry consequence, not when they merely exist. Samyaza's decisions shape outcomes that persist beyond his removal. Authority leaves traces. The question of authority among the Watchers also reflects a deeper tension about oversight itself. To observe is to know. To know is to be implicated. At what point does awareness require action? At what point does restraint become negligence? Samyaza's authority does not resolve this tension. It concentrates it. By assuming leadership, he becomes the focal point of an impossible choice. Whatever decision is made will define the Watcher's legacy. The collective nature of the Watchers complicates the narrative of blame. Authority does not absolve others of responsibility, but it does shape memory. The leader is remembered because memory seeks anchors. The traditions emphasize that Samyaza binds the Watchers together through agreement. This is not the language of revolt, it is the language of risk management. They acknowledge that once involvement begins, withdrawal will no longer be simple. Consequences will follow all of them. Authority here is not coercive, it is organizing. Samyaza does not force compliance. He articulates inevitability. The Watchers recognize that remaining passive is no longer neutral. This moment redefines oversight. The Watchers are no longer merely present, they are deciding. Authority emerges because choice emerges. The question of authority is inseparable from the question of responsibility. Once Samyaza speaks, silence becomes complicity. His leadership makes inaction a position rather than default. The Watcher's decision to remain involved reflects a belief that guidance can stabilize humanity. They assume that knowledge, if structured, can reinforce balance rather than destroy it. This assumption proves false, but it is not irrational. It reflects faith in order rather than contempt for it. Samyaza's authority rests on this faith. He believes that intervention can correct acceleration, that oversight can evolve without collapsing into domination, that proximity can coexist with restraint. The failure of this belief does not retroactively turn authority into rebellion. It reveals the limits of oversight in a system undergoing rapid transformation. As human societies absorb knowledge, they do not merely gain tools, they reorganize values. Hierarchies shift. Violence becomes more efficient. Inequality deepens. Authority centralizes. These changes exceed the Watcher's capacity to manage outcomes indirectly. Samyaza's leadership becomes associated with these outcomes because leadership implies responsibility for consequence, even when intent differs from result. The traditions that preserve his name do not dwell on personal ambition. They dwell on aftermath. His authority is defined by what follows, not by how it began. This framing aligns with the form of punishment described later. Samyaza is restrained, not erased. Authority is neutralized by isolation. Oversight is withdrawn to restore distance. If authority were rebellion, destruction would follow. Instead, containment does. This distinction reinforces the idea that the Watcher's error lies in proximity, not defiance. Samyaza's leadership marks the point where oversight becomes intervention. The Watchers cross from observing a system to shaping it. Authority becomes consequential because the system no longer self-corrects. This moment cannot be undone. Knowledge once given cannot be reclaimed. Authority once exercised cannot be forgotten. Humanity moves forward bearing the imprint of accelerated development. The Watcher's authority dissolves because its purpose dissolves. Oversight can no longer function within altered conditions. Distance must be re-established. Samyaza's role concludes not with triumph or downfall, but with removal. His authority ends because the system that required it no longer exists. What remains is memory. Humanity inherits knowledge without guidance. Structures persist without oversight. Authority becomes a human concern rather than a cosmic one. The question of authority among the Watchers is therefore not about power, but about threshold. Samyaza stands at the boundary where observation becomes decision, where responsibility becomes visible, where silence becomes impossible. As the narrative continues, this authority leads directly to collective commitment. Once leadership exists, withdrawal becomes betrayal. The next step follows naturally, not as rebellion, but as binding agreement, as the Watchers move together into a choice that will reshape humanity permanently, without yet fully understanding the cost. The moment remembered as the oath on Mount Hermon does not arrive with thunder, spectacle, or sudden defiance. It emerges slowly, almost reluctantly, as a response to a situation that has already moved beyond uncertainty. By the time the oath is taken, the Watchers are no longer debating whether involvement carries risk. That question has already been answered by circumstance. What remains is whether responsibility will be shared or fragmented, whether consequence will fall on individuals acting alone or on a collective that accepts the weight together. The setting itself matters. A mountain is not chosen for secrecy, nor for dominance, but for separation. High places in ancient traditions function as thresholds. They are not fully of the earth, but not beyond it either. They provide distance without disappearance. Mount Hermon, in the memory preserved by later texts, serves precisely this role. It is a place removed from human settlements yet still overlooking them, a space where observation and decision intersect. The oath is not framed as an act of rebellion against a higher order. It is framed as a response to inevitability. The Watchers have already remained present too long. Proximity has already eroded distance. Knowledge has already begun to transfer in uneven ways. At this point, withdrawal would not restore balance. It would simply abandon a process already in motion. This is why the oath binds rather than liberates. Oaths in ancient contexts are instruments of limitation, not freedom. They close off alternatives. They fix commitment. By swearing together, the Watchers acknowledge that what follows cannot be undone, and that no single one among them will carry the burden alone. The language associated with the oath emphasizes fear rather than ambition. Later traditions describe anxiety, hesitation, awareness of consequence. This is not the psychology of conquest. It is the psychology of containment. The Watchers understand that fragmentation would amplify damage. Individual involvement would produce uneven influence, conflicting guidance, and uncontrolled escalation. Collective commitment is seen as the lesser risk. Samyaza's role at this moment is not to compel, but to articulate what others already perceive. His authority crystallizes because he names the consequence that silence would produce. If some intervene while others withdraw, the system fractures. Humanity receives knowledge without coherence. Power accumulates without counterbalance. The oath resolves this internal dilemma by enforcing uniformity of action. All who remain will remain fully. All who act will accept consequence together. This decision reflects an attempt to preserve order within the Watchers, even as external balance deteriorates. Mount Hermon becomes symbolic not because of geography, but because of timing. It marks the transition from oversight to participation. Before this moment, involvement is incremental and reversible. After it, the process becomes irreversible. The oath does not specify outcomes. It does not describe the future in detail. It commits only to presence and shared responsibility. This ambiguity is critical. The Watchers do not believe they are choosing catastrophe. They believe they are choosing management. The fear recorded in later traditions is not fear of punishment. It is fear of imbalance. They understand that the knowledge already circulating among humans is reshaping societies. Metalwork, measurement, written symbols, and specialized skills are altering social hierarchies. Violence is becoming more efficient. Authority is centralizing. These changes are accelerating faster than cultural structures can adapt. The Watchers interpret this acceleration as a signal that oversight must evolve. Passive observation can no longer stabilize outcomes. Guidance appears necessary to prevent collapse. The oath reflects this belief. Importantly, the oath does not involve a declaration of independence from the higher order that authorized oversight in the first place. There is no claim that the Watchers now rule themselves. There is no rejection of hierarchy. The oath exists within the system, not against it. This distinction explains the nature of the response that follows later. The Watchers are not treated as traitors. They are treated as liabilities. Their continued presence creates distortion. Removal restores distance. The oath also reveals a deep awareness of moral entanglement. By acting together, the Watchers prevent scapegoating. No individual can later claim innocence through restraint while benefiting from collective outcome. Responsibility is equalized. This equalization is crucial. It suggests that the Watchers understand that intervention, even well-intentioned, carries ethical weight. They do not minimize this weight, they formalize it. The oath transforms involvement into obligation. Once sworn, withdrawal becomes betrayal. Silence becomes complicity. The Watchers lock themselves into a path that cannot be exited gradually. From this point forward, the narrative shifts. Events no longer unfold as isolated decisions. They become consequences of commitment. Teaching intensifies. Interaction deepens. Boundaries erode further. The mountain setting reinforces this shift. High places are where decisions echo. They are visible even when words are not heard. The oath on Mount Hermon becomes a fixed point in memory because it marks where restraint ended collectively. Later traditions exaggerate or moralize this moment, casting it as defiance or temptation. But the earliest framing emphasizes coordination under pressure. The Watchers do not celebrate the oath. They brace for what follows. The oath also reflects a recognition that humanity cannot be selectively changed. Knowledge does not remain contained within individual communities. It spreads through imitation, trade, conflict, and migration. Partial intervention would be more destabilizing than full engagement. This recognition drives the Watchers toward total commitment rather than cautious retreat. They believe that structured involvement can mitigate harm, that guidance can prevent excess, that presence can substitute for absence. This belief underestimates the transformative power of knowledge itself. Once introduced, information reorganizes systems regardless of intention. The Watchers assume they can shape outcomes without becoming the source of them. This assumption fails, but at the moment of the oath, failure is not yet visible. Only risk is, and risk, when shared, feels manageable. The oath also redefines Samyaza's authority. Until this point, his leadership coordinates discussion. After the oath, it anchors consequence. His name becomes associated with the decision, because memory requires focus. The Watchers do not swear allegiance to Samyaza. They swear to each other. This detail is often overlooked. Authority remains collective. Samyaza functions as voice, not ruler. This collective oath blurs individual agency. Actions that follow cannot be traced to singular intent. Teaching becomes shared. Influence becomes distributed. Responsibility becomes diffuse. This diffusion complicates later judgment. Who bears blame when outcomes exceed intention? The narrative resolves this by associating leadership with consequence. Samyaza's name carries the weight of collective action. The oath also signals that the Watchers understand removal may follow. They do not expect immunity. They fear consequence but proceed anyway. This willingness suggests that they perceive collapse as worse than punishment. In this sense, the oath is protective rather than defiant. It seeks to shield humanity from uncontrolled acceleration by accepting risk themselves. The tragedy lies in miscalculation rather than malice. The Watchers believe they can guide without transforming. They believe proximity can be maintained without contamination. They believe authority can remain invisible. The oath locks these beliefs into action. From this point on, correction becomes impossible without removal. Mount Hermon fades from the narrative after this moment because its purpose is complete. It serves as threshold, not stage. What matters is not the place, but the commitment made there. As the Watchers descend again among humanity, they do so bound by decision. Teaching becomes deliberate, interaction becomes sustained, influence deepens. The oath marks the final moment where withdrawal remains theoretically possible. After it, the world moves forward altered. Humanity does not witness the oath. It feels only its consequences. Knowledge spreads faster, skills sharpen, power consolidates, violence intensifies, growth accelerates. The Watchers remain present, but the distance that once defined oversight is gone. Authority becomes influence. Influence becomes distortion. The oath on Mount Hermon therefore stands as the hinge of the entire narrative. It is not dramatic because it does not need to be. Its significance lies in finality. From here, the story does not branch. It narrows. The Watchers have chosen involvement fully. The system they were meant to observe will now bear their imprint permanently. As the narrative continues, attention turns to what that involvement looks like in practice. What knowledge is shared? How humanity responds? How growth transforms into imbalance? The oath does not create change. It commits to it. And once commitment is made, consequence follows without pause, carrying both Watchers and humanity forward together into a world that cannot return to what it was before restraint gave way to decision. When later traditions speak of forbidden knowledge, they often compress meaning into a single moral category, as though the act of teaching itself were inherently corrupt. But in the earliest layers of this story, the idea of forbidden things does not begin as a list of prohibited subjects. It begins as a question of timing, capacity, and consequence. Knowledge is not framed as evil. It is framed as weight, something that alters the structure of the one who carries it, and by extension, the structure of the society that must absorb it. To teach humanity forbidden things did not mean revealing secrets that were arbitrarily withheld. It meant introducing forms of understanding that exceeded the stabilizing limits of the world humanity inhabited at the time. The prohibition was not moral in origin. It was structural. Certain knowledge reshapes behavior so thoroughly that it destabilizes existing systems before new ones can form to replace them. In the world before this transmission, human knowledge evolved through friction with environment. Skills developed slowly because they required trial, error, and generational memory. Tools improved because survival demanded it, not because possibility invited it. Each innovation carried its own period of adjustment, during which social norms, power relationships, and collective behavior recalibrated. Forbidden knowledge bypasses this process. It compresses time. It introduces outcomes without the formative struggle that usually prepares a society to absorb them. This compression is what made the knowledge dangerous, not its content alone. The Watchers did not teach humanity abstract philosophy or distant metaphysics in these earliest accounts. They taught techniques, methods, practices that immediately altered how humans interacted with each other and with their environment. Metalworking is repeatedly emphasized because it transforms multiple domains simultaneously. It reshapes labor, warfare, trade, and hierarchy in a single step. Before metal tools, power is limited by physical endurance and proximity. After metal, force becomes scalable. Weapons extend reach. Armor redistributes risk. Specialized labor emerges. Those who control production control survival. Violence becomes more efficient. Authority consolidates. This transformation does not require malice. It requires capability. Once a society gains tools that allow a small group to dominate a larger one, the social fabric stretches unevenly. Equality becomes unstable. Conflict escalates. Teaching such skills is not merely educational, it is political, even if unintended. The Watchers may not have sought control, but knowledge itself reorganizes control wherever it enters. The traditions also emphasize instruction in measurement, calculation, and symbolic representation. These forms of knowledge underpin administration. They allow land to be divided, resources to be counted, debts to be recorded, and obligations to be enforced beyond immediate memory. This enables states, but it also enables exploitation. Before these tools, authority depends on presence and consensus. After them, authority can persist through abstraction. Records replace witnesses. Systems outlast individuals. Power becomes impersonal. The danger of this shift lies not in organisation itself, but in scale. Human societies were not yet equipped to regulate institutions larger than personal relationships. The sudden appearance of administrative knowledge outpaced ethical frameworks capable of restraining it. Forbidden knowledge therefore functions as an accelerant. It amplifies existing tendencies rather than creating new ones. Ambition, fear, cooperation and violence all intensify. The Watchers did not invent human desire for dominance, they magnified its reach. The consequences that follow reflect this amplification rather than a corruption imposed from outside. The concept of forbidden also implies boundary. Knowledge is forbidden because it crosses a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. Once humanity learns how to shape metal, it cannot return to stone. Once it learns how to record obligations, it cannot forget hierarchy. Teaching forbidden things means permanently altering trajectory. It removes future choice by collapsing paths that once diverged gradually. This is why later traditions treat the act with such gravity. The Watchers are not accused of deception. They are accused of revealing too much, too quickly, without the slow cultural maturation that might have absorbed the shock. The Watchers themselves appear aware of this risk, but not fully of its magnitude. They assume that guidance can offset acceleration, that presence can moderate excess, that instruction can be paired with restraint. This assumption underestimates the autonomy of systems once knowledge enters them. Humans do not merely learn techniques, they repurpose them according to existing pressures. Knowledge spreads beyond intention. It is copied, adapted, and weaponized. The Watchers teach, but they do not control uptake. They do not dictate use. They cannot recall instruction once shared. The very act of teaching transfers agency. This is where the notion of forbidden shifts from prevention to regret. Knowledge becomes forbidden only after its effects destabilize the balance it was meant to improve. The texts preserve this shift subtly. Early references emphasize skill. Later ones emphasize excess. Growth becomes described as distortion. Physical stature increases. Violence multiplies. The Nephilim appear not as monsters in their earliest framing, but as outcomes of imbalance. Beings who embody accelerated growth without proportion. Teaching forbidden things alters not only society, but biology in the mythic imagination. Human bodies themselves are described as changing under the pressure of new conditions. Strength increases, appetites expand, limits erode. This imagery reflects a perception that accelerated knowledge does not remain abstract. It reshapes embodiment. Work intensifies. Warfare hardens bodies. Social stratification alters nutrition and survival. Inequality becomes physical. The Watchers do not anticipate this cascade. Their understanding of knowledge remains compartmentalized. They assume that techniques can be taught independently of social consequence. This assumption fails. What makes the knowledge forbidden is not divine jealousy or fear of competition. It is incompatibility with existing equilibrium. Humanity changes faster than cultural norms can restrain behavior. The Watchers' continued presence exacerbates this instability. Their authority legitimizes learning. Their guidance normalizes transformation. Humans interpret instruction as endorsement. This dynamic creates feedback. Success reinforces adoption. Power concentrates around those closest to instruction. Dependency forms. Human leaders emerge who wield knowledge without restraint. The Watchers intended to guide humanity. Instead, they accelerate hierarchy. Authority becomes centralized. Conflict escalates. resource extraction intensifies, the environment strains under increased exploitation, the forbidden nature of the knowledge becomes evident only after these outcomes manifest. Prohibition arises as reaction, not foresight. Later traditions recast this process into moral language because morality is how societies process irreversible change. Blame simplifies complexity. Prohibition explains loss. The Watchers are blamed because they stand at the point of transfer. Humanity is not destroyed because it did not choose acceleration consciously. It responded to opportunity. Teaching forbidden things therefore implicates the teacher more than the learner in these narratives. The Watchers are expected to know the weight of knowledge. Humanity is expected only to survive with what it is given. This expectation reflects a worldview where responsibility scales with awareness. The more one knows, the greater the burden of restraint. The Watchers violate this principle not by intention, but by misjudgment. The phrase forbidden also conceals another dimension. Some knowledge is forbidden because it reveals structural truths that destabilize belief. Understanding metallurgy, astronomy, or calculation shifts how humans perceive causality. The world becomes manipulable rather than given. This shift undermines mythic frameworks that rely on cyclical acceptance. Agency expands, control replaces submission. Humans begin to see themselves as shapers rather than participants. This psychological transformation may be the most profound consequence of teaching forbidden things. Once humans believe they can reshape reality, they begin to do so without regard for inherited limits. The Watchers likely underestimated this internal change. Teaching skills is one thing, teaching agency is another. As humans internalize the idea that knowledge grants power, restraint erodes. Expansion becomes expectation. Progress becomes imperative. Stability becomes stagnation. The forbidden nature of the knowledge thus lies in its effect on desire. It creates appetite without natural boundary. Growth becomes self-justifying. The Watchers cannot reverse this shift. They remain present, attempting to moderate outcomes, but their influence diminishes as human systems gain momentum. At this stage, removal becomes the only corrective option. The Watchers are no longer stabilizers. They are amplifiers. Teaching forbidden things therefore marks the irreversible phase of the narrative. Everything that follows unfolds from this transfer. Judgment, removal, imprisonment, and memory all respond to consequences already set in motion. Humanity does not return to ignorance. It adapts to imbalance. It learns to live with inherited acceleration. The Watchers' punishment reflects this reality. They are restrained because further teaching would compound distortion. Humanity is left with knowledge and no overseers. This absence forces internal regulation. Ethics, law, and tradition emerge as substitutes for external guidance. Humanity must now manage what it has received. The story does not frame this outcome as wholly negative. Civilization emerges. Art, architecture, governance, and science develop. But they do so under strain. Violence persists. Inequality deepens. Collapse recurs. Teaching forbidden things changed humanity forever because it altered trajectory, not destiny. The world becomes one of progress and crisis rather than continuity and balance. The Watchers' error is not that they taught, but that they taught without exit. Once humanity crossed the threshold, there was no return to gradual evolution. This chapter does not end with condemnation. It ends with consequence unfolding. The knowledge remains. The systems adapt unevenly. The world moves forward carrying both advancement and instability as inseparable companions. As the narrative continues, attention shifts from teaching to aftermath, from transfer to result, from intention to legacy. The knowledge has already done its work. What remains is to trace how humanity responds when growth outpaces restraint, and how the Watchers themselves are transformed from guides into liabilities within a system they helped accelerate beyond control. The knowledge that altered humanity's trajectory did not arrive as a single revelation or dramatic moment of awakening. It unfolded through accumulation, through repetition, through quiet shifts that only revealed their full weight after they had already reshaped the direction of human life. What made this knowledge transformative was not its novelty alone, but the way it rearranged priorities, expectations, and limits all at once, without allowing time for equilibrium to re-establish itself. Before this turning point, human existence followed paths shaped largely by constraint. Geography, climate, bodily endurance, and seasonal cycles defined what was possible. Progress occurred, but it moved at the pace of lived experience. Tools improved slowly, social roles evolved cautiously, authority remained localized, tethered to personal presence and communal memory. Change was absorbed because it arrived incrementally. The knowledge that entered during this period disrupted that rhythm. It did not simply add new capabilities, it rewired the logic by which capability was understood. Possibility expanded faster than consequence could be evaluated. Humanity gained the means to alter its environment in ways that exceeded prior imagination. And with that gain came a fundamental reorientation of how people related to the world and to one another. This knowledge was practical rather than abstract. It dealt with how matter could be shaped, how forces could be directed, how outcomes could be predicted and controlled. Metallurgy stands at the center of this shift because it collapses multiple forms of power into one. With metal comes durability, with durability comes permanence, with permanence comes accumulation. Structures last longer, weapons penetrate deeper, tools outlive their makers. The human relationship to time changes under these conditions. When objects endure, planning extends beyond a single lifespan. Decisions begin to account for future control rather than immediate survival. Ownership becomes transferable, wealth becomes storable. Inequality ceases to be situational and becomes structural. This alteration in time perception is critical. Humanity moves from reacting to conditions toward shaping them. The environment becomes something to manage rather than accommodate. Nature shifts from partner to resource. Measurement and calculation deepen this transformation. Once quantities can be abstracted, reality becomes divisible. Land is no longer simply occupied. It is measured, bounded, claimed. Labor becomes countable. Obligation becomes enforceable. Value becomes comparable across contexts. These tools enable coordination at scale, but they also enable domination at scale. Authority no longer depends on physical presence or shared memory. It persists through systems. Decisions can be enforced remotely, impersonally, and repeatedly. The trajectory shifts from communal balance to hierarchical expansion. Human groups no longer need to remain small to function. They grow, consolidate, and compete. Conflict escalates not because aggression increases, but because capacity does. This knowledge also reshapes identity. Skill becomes specialization. Specialization creates dependency. Dependency centralizes power. Those who control instruction control outcome. The watcher's involvement accelerates this process by reducing the friction that usually tempers adoption. Instead of slow discovery, humans receive refined technique. Instead of experimentation, they receive instruction. The learning curve collapses. When learning collapses, adaptation lags. Cultural norms, ethical frameworks, and restraint mechanisms do not have time to mature alongside capability. The result is imbalance. This imbalance expresses itself physically in the traditions. Growth becomes excessive. Consumption intensifies. Violence spreads. The Nephilim, as they appear in later accounts, embody this imbalance symbolically. They are not merely large in size. They represent disproportion, the mismatch between power and control. The trajectory change is therefore not linear improvement. It is acceleration without regulation. Humanity does not simply advance. It destabilizes. This destabilization does not remain confined to elites or leaders. It permeates daily life. Work intensifies, hierarchies harden, resources concentrate, margins widen. Survival becomes conditional on position rather than participation. The knowledge that enables agriculture, metallurgy, and administration also enables exploitation. Surplus allows specialization, but it also enables coercion. Those without access become labor rather than partners. Human relationships shift accordingly. Trust erodes beyond immediate circles. Systems replace kinship. Enforcement replaces consensus. The Watchers likely understood some of these risks but underestimated their scope. They perceived knowledge as additive rather than transformative. They believed guidance could offset imbalance. They assumed oversight could restrain excess. But once the trajectory shifts, restraint must come from within the system itself. External guidance loses relevance as internal momentum builds. The knowledge also alters humanity's relationship with the unseen. As causality becomes more apparent, mystery recedes. Phenomena once attributed to cycles or fate become subjects of manipulation. Control replaces reverence. This does not eliminate belief, but it reshapes it. Gods become patrons of technique rather than embodiments of order. Ritual aligns with productivity rather than balance. Success becomes validation. The trajectory change is therefore spiritual as well as material. Humanity begins to see itself as capable of rivaling the forces that once defined its limits. Hubris is not taught, it emerges. This is why later traditions frame the knowledge as forbidden, not because it should never be known, but because it arrives without the internal structures necessary to hold it responsibly. The prohibition reflects recognition of harm, not fear of progress. The Watcher's removal does not reverse the trajectory. Humanity continues forward, carrying both capability and consequence. The world does not collapse entirely. It reorganizes around new norms. Civilization emerges from this instability. Cities rise. Writing spreads. Law codifies behavior. Institutions attempt to regulate excess. These developments represent humanity's attempt to internalize oversight. But the cost remains. Violence persists. Inequality deepens. Collapse recurs. Each cycle repeats the pattern of growth outpacing restraint. The knowledge that changed humanity's trajectory cannot be unlearned. It becomes inheritance rather than instruction. Later generations are born into systems already shaped by acceleration. This inheritance defines the human condition moving forward. Progress becomes expectation. Expansion becomes default. Stability becomes temporary. The Watchers fade from presence, but their influence remains embedded in structures. Humanity no longer needs external teachers. It teaches itself. This self-directed acceleration creates a new dilemma. Without oversight, restraint must be constructed artificially. Law, ethics, and tradition attempt to fill the void left by withdrawn observers. These mechanisms function unevenly. They succeed in some contexts and fail in others. The trajectory remains unstable. The narrative does not suggest that humanity would have remained static without this knowledge. Change was inevitable. What changed was pace. Acceleration transforms destiny by compressing choice. Paths that might have diverged slowly collapse into single trajectories driven by momentum rather than deliberation. The Watcher's greatest impact lies not in what they taught, but in how fast humanity moved once teaching began. The world becomes one where adaptation chases capability rather than guiding it. This mismatch continues to define human history. Each new technology repeats the pattern. Capability arrives first. Ethics follow later. The ancient story recognizes this pattern intuitively. It frames the first acceleration as foundational, the moment when humanity crossed from gradual evolution into self-driven transformation. The knowledge that changed the human trajectory therefore marks the beginning of history as struggle rather than continuity. Progress and crisis become inseparable. As the narrative continues, attention shifts toward consequence, toward the strain placed on systems unable to absorb rapid change, toward the response from the structures that once maintained balance. The trajectory has already shifted. The world cannot return to what it was. What remains is adjustment, correction, and containment. The Watcher's presence becomes increasingly untenable as humanity's momentum exceeds their capacity to guide. Their role transforms from stabilizers into symbols of interference. The knowledge remains. The trajectory continues. The question becomes not what was taught, but how humanity lives with what it has received. From here, the story moves toward tension. Growth strains balance, authority tightens, violence escalates, oversight turns into judgment. The knowledge has done its work. Humanity is no longer what it was, and nothing that follows can be understood without recognizing that this change was not a fall from innocence, but a shift into acceleration that defined everything that came after. The moment when guidance became interference is not marked by a single act or clear boundary. It unfolds gradually, almost invisibly, through repetition and proximity. What once felt like necessary involvement slowly begins to alter the very systems it was meant to stabilize. The Watchers do not cross a line knowingly. They discover they have crossed it only when retreat no longer restores what restraint once maintained. In the earliest phase of their involvement, guidance remains contextual. Instruction is offered where confusion arises. Clarification follows imbalance. The Watchers respond to specific pressures rather than reshaping entire systems. Their presence is still light enough that humanity remains primarily self-directed. Innovation spreads, but unevenly. Tradition still moderates adoption. Change remains local. At this stage, guidance functions as correction. It is reactive, not formative. The Watchers respond to problems already present rather than anticipating future consequences. This approach assumes that human system will absorb instruction selectively, filtering what they cannot sustain. It assumes resilience. But acceleration alters this dynamic. As knowledge compounds, problems no longer remain isolated. One solution generates secondary effects elsewhere. Improved tools increase productivity, which intensifies extraction. Extraction alters environment. Environmental strain creates scarcity. Scarcity fuels conflict. Conflict invites further guidance. The Watchers find themselves responding more frequently. Each response appears justified in isolation. Taken together, they begin to form a pattern of sustained involvement. Guidance shifts from occasional to continuous. This is where interference begins, not through intention, but through accumulation. Presence becomes influence. Influence becomes expectation. Humans begin to anticipate guidance rather than adapting independently. The Watcher's authority, once implicit, becomes referenced. Their instruction carries weight beyond practical utility. It legitimizes certain paths over others. Choices narrow. The difference between guidance and interference lies not in content, but in dependency. Guidance supports autonomy. Interference replaces it. As human societies absorb accelerated knowledge, their internal feedback mechanisms weaken. Trial and error shortens. Failure becomes catastrophic rather than instructive. Systems scale faster than they can self-correct. The Watchers attempt to compensate by remaining present. They believe proximity allows moderation. They underestimate how quickly moderation becomes management. Interference emerges when guidance begins shaping outcomes rather than stabilizing conditions. When instruction anticipates behavior instead of responding to it. When systems adjust themselves around expected oversight. At this point, human agency subtly shifts. Responsibility diffuses upward. Decisions are justified by reference to instruction rather than context. Authority externalizes. The Watchers become anchors for legitimacy. Human leaders align themselves with guidance to consolidate power. Instruction becomes a tool of governance. This transformation is not directed by the Watchers, but it is enabled by their presence. Knowledge does not remain neutral once embedded in hierarchy. It amplifies existing structures. As interference deepens, the Watchers face diminishing returns. Each intervention resolves immediate instability but produces broader distortion. Balance becomes harder to restore. They respond by refining guidance. Teaching becomes more detailed. Boundaries become more explicit. This intensifies dependency further. What began as oversight now shapes culture. Practices normalize around instruction. Innovation aligns with taught methods. Alternatives fade. The Watchers are now embedded within human systems rather than observing them. Their role shifts from stabilizer to participant. This participation alters perception. Humans no longer see guidance as external. It becomes part of how the world works. Success is attributed to proximity, failure to absence. The Watchers' withdrawal becomes unimaginable without collapse. They recognize this too late. Interference is not marked by hostility or coercion. It is marked by indispensability. When systems cannot function without guidance, guidance has become interference. The Watchers did not intend to replace human adaptation. They sought to support it. But support without exit creates reliance. This reliance transforms responsibility. Humans no longer bear full consequence for decisions. Oversight diffuses accountability. The Watchers attempt to correct this by encouraging restraint, but restraint taught externally lacks internalization. It does not endure without presence. The paradox becomes clear. The more the Watchers intervene to reduce harm, the more harm becomes dependent on their intervention to remain contained. This feedback loop accelerates instability. Guidance produces need for more guidance. At this stage, removal appears as threat rather than solution. The Watchers hesitate. Withdrawal risks collapse. Presence ensures distortion. This dilemma reveals the true nature of interference. It is not wrongdoing, it is entanglement. The Watchers are entangled in human systems that no longer self-regulate. Humanity is entangled in guidance it no longer questions. The transition from guidance to interference also reshapes how transgression is defined. Boundaries once enforced by culture are now enforced by presence. When presence withdraws, boundaries fail. Later traditions reinterpret this failure as moral collapse, but structurally it is loss of internal regulation. Interference alters pace irreversibly. Human societies adapt to guidance rather than to environment. Innovation accelerates in directions shaped by instruction. The Watcher's presence begins to influence selection itself. Certain practices survive because they align with guidance. Others disappear regardless of merit. This selective pressure reshapes culture. Diversity narrows, systems homogenize, control centralizes. Interference also shifts how humans perceive consequence. Outcomes are no longer attributed solely to action. They are mediated by expectation of oversight. The Watchers become reference points for justice, order, and legitimacy. This role exceeds oversight. It is governance by presence. The narrative preserves traces of this shift by emphasizing escalation rather than rebellion. Violence increases not because humans become evil, but because capacity intensifies without restraint. The Watchers witness this escalation and recognize that their presence amplifies it. Guidance, once corrective, now fuels dependency and distortion. At this moment, the Watcher's original mandate collapses. Oversight assumed autonomy. Autonomy no longer exists in the same form. Interference cannot be undone gradually. Partial withdrawal would destabilize systems calibrated to presence. This recognition sets the stage for judgment, not as punishment, but as corrective separation. Removal becomes the only remaining option. The transition from guidance to interference is therefore the critical inflection point. Everything that follows responds to this structural failure. The Watcher's imprisonment, restraint and removal are not reactions to defiance. They are responses to unsustainable entanglement. Humanity continues forward bearing the imprint of interference. Systems adapt to absence. Internal regulation begins slowly, imperfectly. The memory of the Watchers persists because interference leaves traces even after presence ends. Knowledge remains shaped by how it was introduced. The story does not condemn guidance itself. It warns against guidance without exit. When support replaces adaptation, systems weaken even as they grow stronger. Capability increases, resilience decreases. This paradox defines the aftermath. Humanity advances but stumbles repeatedly. Progress continues but collapse recurs. The Watchers fade from presence, but the pattern they initiated remains embedded in history. Each new acceleration repeats the dilemma. Guidance becomes interference whenever it outpaces internal regulation. The ancient narrative recognizes this pattern long before modern language gives it form. As the story continues, attention shifts toward consequence rather than cause, toward the response of the broader order to unsustainable entanglement. The Watchers have already crossed the threshold. What remains is separation, containment, and the long process of humanity learning to govern what it now carries alone. The guidance has done its work. The interference cannot be reversed. The world moves forward altered, unstable, and permanently accelerated, as the narrative flows into judgment not as condemnation, but as structural necessity, unfolding without finality, without pause. The emergence of the Nephilim is not introduced in the earliest traditions as an act of intentional design. It appears instead as a result, a development that follows from conditions already set in motion. The texts do not linger on planning, nor do they describe deliberation about creating a new kind of being. What they preserve is consequence. Something has changed in the structure of the world, and that change expresses itself physically, socially, and symbolically through figures that did not exist before. The Nephilim are not born into a stable system. They arise within a world already strained by accelerated knowledge, altered hierarchies, and blurred boundaries. Their existence reflects imbalance rather than innovation. They are not described as solutions. They are described as outcomes. In later retellings, the Nephilim are often framed as monstrous or malevolent by nature. But the oldest layers of the tradition are more restrained. They emphasize scale, strength, and excess rather than inherent evil. The Nephilim are large, powerful, and consuming. They are disproportionate to the world around them. This disproportion is the key to understanding them. Their birth follows the erosion of distance between the Watchers and humanity. Proximity alters relationships. Authority legitimizes union. Guidance normalizes integration. What begins as presence becomes intimacy. The boundary between overseer and observed dissolves not in rebellion, but in familiarity. The texts do not describe this process with explicit detail. They hint rather than explain. This restraint suggests discomfort, not uncertainty. The writers recognize that what occurred violated an order they struggled to articulate. They focus instead on what resulted. The Nephilim represent amplification. They embody the acceleration already affecting human society, intensified into form. Where knowledge compressed time, they compress scale. Where power concentrated socially, it concentrates biologically. They are described as mighty, as renowned, as figures of influence. This language does not depict chaos alone, it depicts dominance. The Nephilim do not merely exist, they reshape their surroundings by existing within them. Their presence alters resource distribution. Consumption increases, competition intensifies. Ordinary humans are displaced not only politically, but physically. The imbalance that knowledge introduced now becomes unavoidable. This is why the Nephilim are remembered not as teachers, but as forces. They do not guide, they take, they expand, they exhaust. The traditions describe them as devourers of human labour, and eventually of humanity itself. This language is not literal in a modern sense. It reflects a perception that systems built for human scale cannot sustain entities that exceed it. The Nephilim strain every structure they enter. Economies collapse under their demands. Authority loses coherence. Violence escalates beyond restraint. Importantly, the texts do not suggest that the Watchers intended this outcome. The Nephilim are not described as planned heirs or successors. They are described as unintended consequences. This distinction matters. It reinforces the narrative that the Watchers' failure lies in miscalculation rather than malice. They do not seek to replace humanity. They destabilize it by remaining present too long. The Nephilim arise because systems lack insulation. When accelerated knowledge meets unregulated power, the result is distortion. When authority legitimizes proximity, boundaries collapse. The Watchers' continued involvement creates conditions where union becomes possible and normalized. This normalization erodes restraint further. The Nephilim are therefore not anomalies. They are predictable outcomes within an unstable system. Their scale mirrors the scale of imbalance already present. The traditions struggle to categorize them because they do not fit existing frameworks. They are not gods. They are not humans. They occupy an intermediate space that disrupts classification. This liminality makes them threatening. Systems rely on categories to function. When beings exceed classification, they undermine order simply by existing. The Nephilim are remembered because they reveal the cost of collapsed boundaries. They make visible what knowledge and interference had already begun. Their presence accelerates collapse. Where imbalance once spread gradually, it now concentrates. Where conflict once escalated locally, it becomes systemic. The Watchers observe this escalation and recognize that the situation has exceeded their capacity to moderate. Guidance no longer contains harm. Presence amplifies it. The Nephilim become symbols of this failure. They are not punished individually in the earliest accounts. They are swept away as part of a broader correction. This sweeping does not distinguish intent. It addresses scale. Systems cannot sustain disproportion. The narrative frames the flood and subsequent judgment not as moral cleansing but as reset. The world must be reduced to survivable proportions. The Nephilim disappear because the conditions that sustain them are eliminated. Their removal is structural, not personal. This framing reinforces the idea that their birth was not desired. It was tolerated until it became unsustainable. The Watchers' imprisonment follows the same logic. They are not destroyed. They are restrained. Proximity is removed. Boundaries are restored. Humanity survives because it remains adaptable. It can reorganize. It can rebuild within limits. The Nephilim cannot. They exist only within imbalance. Once the system resets, they vanish. This does not make their story irrelevant. It makes it diagnostic. The Nephilim reveal what happens when growth outpaces regulation. They embody a warning rather than a lineage. Their memory persists because it marks the outer boundary of acceptable acceleration. Later traditions exaggerate their violence and monstrosity to emphasize the danger. But beneath the embellishment lies a consistent message. Scale without restraint destroys the system that produces it. The Nephilim are not evil because they choose to be. They are destructive because they cannot be otherwise within a world not built for them. This interpretation aligns with a broader narrative arc. The Watchers do not fall because they hate humanity. They fail because they misjudge capacity. Humanity does not suffer because it seeks knowledge. It suffers because knowledge arrives faster than adaptation. The Nephilim sit at the intersection of these failures. They are living evidence of imbalance made flesh. Their birth marks the point where correction becomes unavoidable. The system cannot self-regulate while such entities exist. The response that follows targets structure, not symptom. The flood reduces scale. The imprisonment restores distance. The Nephilim vanish because their existence depends on conditions that no longer persist. Their legacy remains in memory as caution. Growth must be tempered. Power must align with structure. Knowledge must be absorbed at a pace that allows restraint to form. The ancient narrative does not condemn ambition outright. It condemns acceleration without containment. The Nephilim are remembered not because they ruled forever, but because they reveal the limit. They mark the moment when unintended consequence becomes undeniable, when guidance has already become interference, when correction must be systemic. From this point forward, the story moves decisively toward response. The birth has occurred, the imbalance is visible, the cost is no longer abstract. What follows is not surprise but inevitability. The system reacts as systems do when thresholds are crossed. The Nephilim do not end the world by themselves. They reveal that the world has already moved beyond stability. Their disappearance does not restore innocence. It restores proportion. Humanity continues, changed but intact. Knowledge remains, but oversight is withdrawn. The Watchers are removed because their presence enables distortion. The Nephilim vanish because distortion cannot survive correction. The narrative flows onward, carrying these consequences forward. Nothing returns to its original state. The world adapts around loss rather than undoing it. The birth of the Nephilim stands as the clearest expression of unintended consequence in the entire tradition. It shows that some outcomes do not require intent to occur. They require only conditions. As the story continues, attention turns to how the world responds once imbalance has reached visible form. Judgment follows not as vengeance but as rebalancing. The Nephilim have already done their work by existing. Their memory persists because it teaches without instruction, and with that memory established, the narrative moves forward, unbroken, toward the strain placed on heaven and earth alike, as the balance between realms begins to fracture under the weight of what has already been set in motion. When the ancient texts describe the period that follows the emergence of the Nephilim, they do not dwell on corruption in the moral sense that later traditions would emphasize. They do not focus on sin, depravity, or conscious wickedness as primary explanations. Instead, they return again and again to language of increase, multiplication, expansion, and excess. Growth, rather than evil, becomes the dominant theme. This choice of emphasis is deliberate, and it reveals how the earliest traditions understood collapse not as a failure of virtue, but as a failure of proportion. Growth in these accounts is not celebrated unconditionally. It is described as something that has surpassed its proper scale. Populations multiply rapidly. Power concentrates. Consumption expands beyond replenishment. Strength increases faster than restraint. The world becomes crowded not only with people, but with activity, noise, and pressure. The problem is not that humanity has become malicious, but that it has become too much for the structures that once sustained it. This distinction is subtle but crucial. Evil implies intent. It implies deliberate violation of known boundaries. Growth implies momentum. It suggests that change has outrun awareness, that consequences have outpaced decision. The texts consistently lean toward the latter explanation. Humanity does not destroy the world because it chooses destruction. It destabilizes it because expansion proceeds without internal limits. The language of the traditions reflects this worldview. Phrases emphasize fullness, abundance, and overflowing presence. The earth is filled, the land is crowded, the noise rises. These descriptions are environmental and systemic rather than moral. They portray a world under strain, not one under judgment for wrongdoing alone. This framing aligns with earlier patterns in the narrative. Knowledge accelerated humanity's trajectory. Guidance became interference. The Nephilim emerged as disproportionate expressions of imbalance. Each stage emphasizes scale rather than corruption. The texts remain consistent in this logic. Evil, in later interpretations, becomes a convenient shorthand. It compresses complex structural failure into a moral category that is easier to explain and transmit. But the earliest layers preserve a more nuanced understanding. They recognize that systems can fail even when individuals act within their perceived roles. Growth without containment produces instability regardless of intent. A society can collapse under success as easily as under malice. The texts acknowledge this by focusing on expansion itself as the catalyst. This perspective reflects the lived experience of early civilizations. Agricultural success led to population booms. Surplus enabled specialization and hierarchy. Hierarchy intensified conflict. Conflict escalated violence. None of these steps required evil motives. They emerged naturally from growth interacting with limited regulation. The ancient writers were intimately familiar with this pattern. Floods, famines, and societal collapse followed periods of prosperity as often as periods of hardship. The lesson embedded in the texts is observational rather than accusatory. By describing growth instead of evil, the traditions avoid framing collapse as punishment for moral failure alone. Instead, they frame it as correction for imbalance. This distinction changes the nature of judgment that follows. It is not retribution, it is rebalancing. The flood in this context is not sent because humanity is wicked, but because the system has exceeded sustainable thresholds. Noise becomes a recurring metaphor here, not because sound is inherently sinful, but because it signifies density, activity, and constant motion. The gods are disturbed not by immorality, but by overload. This metaphor resonates with environmental reality. In dense settlements, noise correlates with congestion, competition, and stress. It marks a world that no longer rests. Restlessness replaces rhythm. The texts also describe violence increasing, but again, violence is treated as consequence rather than cause. As resources strain and hierarchies harden, conflict intensifies. Strength becomes advantage. Might becomes right. This is not framed as humanity choosing cruelty, but as power expressing itself in an unregulated system. Even the Nephilim, often later cast as embodiments of evil, are originally described in terms of size, hunger, and dominance rather than malice. They consume because consumption defines them. They exhaust because they are disproportionate. Their violence reflects capacity, not intent. This approach allows the narrative to remain internally coherent. If evil were the primary issue, punishment would target morality. Instead, the response targets scale. The world is reduced, numbers are limited, lifespans shorten, boundaries reassert. These measures address growth directly. They do not reform character. They constrain expansion. The shortening of human lifespan in later traditions fits this pattern. It is not described as punishment for sin, but as a limitation imposed to prevent recurrence of imbalance. Mortality becomes a regulatory mechanism. Population control emerges as structural necessity. Similarly, the Watchers are removed not because they are evil, but because their presence enables acceleration. Their imprisonment restores distance. Distance restores proportion. The texts consistently treat excess as the core problem. Excess of knowledge, excess of power, excess of presence, excess of scale. By framing the issue this way, the traditions avoid portraying the divine as reactive moral arbiters. Instead, they appear as custodians of balance, responding to systemic stress rather than individual wrongdoing. This worldview reflects a cosmology where order precedes morality. Balance comes before virtue. Harmony is foundational, and ethics arise as responses to maintaining it. Later religious interpretations invert this sequence, placing morality first and balance as its consequence. But the earliest texts suggest the opposite. When balance fails, morality collapses with it. Restoring balance becomes prerequisite for ethical order. Understanding this helps explain why the texts do not single out humanity for condemnation. Humans are participants in a system that has grown beyond its limits. They suffer consequences, but they are not annihilated. Survivors remain because adaptation is still possible. Humanity can be reduced, constrained, and reorganized. Growth can be slowed. Boundaries can be reintroduced. The Nephilim, by contrast, cannot be accommodated. Their scale exceeds correction. They vanish because they are expressions of imbalance, not adaptable beings. This distinction reinforces the theme that the problem is not evil nature, but unsustainable form. The emphasis on growth also explains why the texts describe gradual deterioration rather than sudden corruption. Things worsen incrementally. Pressure builds, noise rises, consumption increases, violence spreads. There is no single moment of moral collapse. This gradualism mirrors how real systems fail. Collapse rarely arrives unannounced. It accumulates. The ancient writers observed this pattern and encoded it in mythic language. They did not moralize prematurely. They described what they saw. By focusing on growth rather than evil, the texts preserve a diagnostic function. They teach recognition rather than condemnation. They warn against excess without demanding purity. This makes the narrative enduring. It can be reapplied to different eras without requiring identical moral frameworks. Growth remains a universal challenge. The later shift toward moral language reflects cultural evolution rather than original intent. As societies developed codified ethics, they reinterpreted earlier stories to reinforce moral norms. Evil becomes explanatory shorthand. But the deeper structure remains visible beneath later overlays. Growth destabilizes systems. Correction restores proportion. This understanding also reframes humanity's role. Humans are not portrayed as inherently corrupt. They are portrayed as capable of outgrowing their own structures. This portrayal is neither flattering nor condemning. It is realistic. The texts do not absolve humanity of responsibility. Growth may be momentum, but restraint still matters. The problem is that restraint was not yet internalized. External oversight compensated temporarily. Once oversight withdrew, humanity had to develop internal limits. This transition marks the birth of law, ethics, and tradition as substitutes for divine presence. Humanity begins to regulate itself because it must. The flood narrative thus becomes a boundary between externally regulated balance and internally managed restraint. By describing growth rather than evil, the texts justify this transition. Humanity is not wiped out. It is forced to mature. The removal of the Watchers reinforces this maturation. Guidance ends. Responsibility shifts inward. The world that follows is harsher but more stable. Lifespans shorten. Population growth slows. Knowledge spreads unevenly but gradually. This is not a return to innocence. It is an adjustment to consequence. The emphasis on growth allows the narrative to avoid fatalism. Humanity is not doomed by nature. It is challenged by scale. This perspective leaves room for adaptation, learning, and recovery. Collapse is not final. It is corrective. The ancient writers understood that cycles of growth and correction repeat. Their stories encode pattern rather than verdict. This is why the texts linger on increase rather than transgression. They are concerned with dynamics, not moral tallying. As the narrative moves forward, judgment emerges not as condemnation, but as intervention aimed at restoring manageability. Heaven responds to strain, not to depravity alone. The focus on growth prepares the ground for this response. It explains why action becomes necessary without framing it as wrath. The world has become too large, too loud, too fast. The solution is not destruction for its own sake, but reduction. This reduction reshapes everything that follows. Humanity survives, altered but constrained. Knowledge remains, but pace slows. The texts describe growth because growth explains consequence without simplifying complexity. Evil simplifies. Growth explains. This distinction preserves the coherence of the narrative from beginning to end, from accelerated knowledge to interference, from unintended consequence to correction. As the story continues, the emphasis on growth gives way to emphasis on strain. Heaven and earth begin to fracture under pressure. What follows is not surprise, but response. The system acts to restore balance, not to erase humanity. The description of growth, not evil, ensures that the response is proportional. It targets scale rather than intent. This framing carries forward as the narrative turns toward judgment, imprisonment, and withdrawal, all aimed at re-establishing distance and proportion rather than moral purification. The world does not become perfect afterward. It becomes survivable, and in that survivability the story continues, shaped by the knowledge it cannot forget and the limits it must now learn to live within, as the tension between expansion and restraint carries the narrative onward without pause. The balance between heaven, earth and flesh does not collapse all at once. It stretches first, it thins, it holds under pressure longer than expected, not because it is strong enough, but because it was built to endure gradual change, not acceleration. The strain described in the text emerges quietly, through signs that something once aligned is no longer moving together. In the earliest conception of the world, these three domains are not in opposition. Heaven is not distant command, earth is not passive material, and flesh is not rebellious matter. They exist in relation. Each has limits, each occupies its place. Order depends on proportion rather than dominance. Heaven represents continuity and structure. Not control in the modern sense, but consistency. It is the domain of cycles, of patterns that repeat regardless of individual action. Earth represents stability and constraint. It provides resources, but only within limits. Flesh represents agency and adaptation. It acts, responds, learns, and changes, but within the boundaries set by the other two. When these domains are balanced, change occurs slowly. Flesh adapts to earth. Earth responds to cycles of heaven. Heaven remains steady, providing rhythm rather than intervention. No single domain overwhelms the others. The strain begins when flesh accelerates faster than earth can absorb, and faster than heaven can accommodate without disruption. This acceleration does not originate in defiance. It originates in capability. As knowledge spreads and systems expand, flesh becomes more active. Human populations grow denser, labour intensifies, extraction increases, landscapes change. The earth is asked to yield more than before, more quickly, and with less recovery. At first, the earth absorbs this pressure. Fertile land expands through irrigation. Forests recede. Rivers are redirected. These changes appear successful. Surplus increases. Security improves. Growth is rewarded. But each adjustment narrows margin. Soils degrade. Water systems strain. Resource distribution becomes uneven. Competition intensifies. The earth does not protest loudly. It responds subtly, through reduced yield, through instability, through unpredictability. Heaven remains steady. Seasons continue. Cycles persist. The contrast between celestial consistency and terrestrial strain becomes more pronounced. This contrast creates tension. When outcomes diverge from expectation, interpretation shifts. Failure is no longer attributed solely to chance. Imbalance becomes suspect. Flesh responds to strain by pushing harder. More extraction, more control, more effort. Solutions intensify the same behaviours that created pressure. This feedback loop widens the gap between capability and sustainability. Flesh becomes increasingly dominant in shaping outcomes, but increasingly fragile in maintaining stability. The Watcher's continued presence complicates this strain. Their guidance legitimizes expansion. Their oversight reassures those pushing boundaries. Growth appears sanctioned. This does not mean the Watchers command excess. It means their proximity alters perception. Restraint loses urgency when oversight remains present. The balance begins to tilt. Flesh encroaches upon earth beyond replenishment. Heaven's patterns remain unchanged, but their meaning shifts. They no longer reassure. They expose disparity. Noise becomes a key metaphor in the text at this stage. Noise is not merely sound, it represents constant activity, density, and unrest. A world that does not rest cannot rebalance. The gods are described as disturbed not because of offence, but because disturbance indicates systemic overload. Heaven, as structure, experiences strain when the domains below no longer align with its rhythms. This strain is not emotional in the modern sense, it is functional. A system built on proportion cannot tolerate sustained disproportion without correction. Flesh, empowered by knowledge, pushes beyond inherited limits. Earth, constrained by physical reality, cannot match pace. Heaven, bound to consistency, does not adjust to accommodate imbalance. The triadic balance fractures. This fracture does not immediately destroy any domain. Instead, it produces instability at their intersections. Floods increase, droughts intensify, conflict escalates, disease spreads. These are not punishments, they are stress responses. The texts do not attribute these phenomena to anger alone. They present them as outcomes of misalignment. The Nephilim intensify this strain. Their scale magnifies consumption. Their presence accelerates depletion. Where flesh already presses against Earth's limits, they exceed them. This creates a cascading effect. Ordinary humans are displaced. Resources are monopolized. Violence escalates. Survival becomes competitive rather than cooperative. Earth bears the brunt of this escalation. Landscapes are altered irreversibly. Stability erodes. Heaven remains steady, but its steadiness now exacerbates contrast. The unchanging sky emphasizes the volatility below. This tension between consistency and volatility becomes unbearable. A system built on alignment cannot sustain prolonged divergence. The Watchers recognize this strain too late. Their presence, meant to stabilize, now amplifies pressure. Withdrawal risks collapse. Presence ensures distortion. The balance between heaven, earth, and flesh has already shifted. Correction must address structure, not behavior alone. This is why the response described in later texts targets scale rather than morality. Lifespans are shortened, population growth is limited, distance is restored. These measures reduce pressure on Earth. They slow flesh. They realign pace with cycle. Heaven does not change. Earth recovers gradually. Flesh adapts under new constraints. The flood, in this framework, is not annihilation. It is release. It resets proportion by reducing density and activity. The imprisonment of the Watchers restores separation. Oversight withdraws. Flesh must now regulate itself. The balance does not return to its original state. Knowledge remains. Capability persists, but constraints tighten. This tightening introduces mortality as a stabilizer. Death limits accumulation. Memory becomes generational rather than continuous. Earth benefits from reduced extraction. Recovery becomes possible. Heaven's cycles remain constant, but their role shifts. They become reference rather than anchor. The balance is altered, but it is functional again. The strain described in the texts is therefore not a moral failure, but a systemic one. Domains fell out of proportion. This understanding reframes judgment. It is not retaliation, it is recalibration. The ancient writers understood that systems collapse when pace exceeds structure. Their stories encode this insight in mythic language. The balance between heaven, earth, and flesh strains whenever one domain dominates without restraint. In this narrative, flesh expands beyond Earth's capacity and beyond heaven's tolerance for misalignment. The correction restores proportion by limiting flesh and withdrawing guidance. This pattern repeats throughout history. Each acceleration tests balance, each correction reshapes constraint. The story of the Watchers and the Nephilim represents the first remembered instance of this pattern. As the narrative continues, the strain becomes visible not only in environment and society, but in divine response. Judgment emerges as system maintenance rather than moral condemnation. The balance has already failed. What follows is not surprise, but necessity. The world does not end, it contracts. It reorganizes around new limits. Humanity survives because it can adapt to constraint. Earth recovers because pressure lessens. Heaven remains unchanged because consistency is its nature. The strain marks the transition from externally balanced order to internally regulated existence. From this point forward, humanity must learn restraint without direct oversight. The watchers fade from presence. The Nephilim vanish with imbalance. The world continues under new parameters. The balance is no longer effortless. It must be maintained deliberately. This is the cost of acceleration. Once pace increases, equilibrium cannot remain automatic. The ancient texts do not mourn this loss, they record it. As the story moves forward, attention shifts from strain to response, from imbalance to intervention, from stretched alignment to decisive separation. The balance has already been tested and found wanting. What follows unfolds not as catastrophe alone, but as reconfiguration, carrying the narrative onward without pause, without closure, as the system responds to restore what can still be preserved. Divine oversight does not transform into judgment abruptly, nor does it arise from outrage or wounded authority. The shift occurs because oversight has reached the limits of what it can correct through presence alone. What was once maintained by observation, guidance, and distance now requires separation. Judgment in this context is not emotional response, it is structural action. In the earliest framework, oversight functions through balance. Heaven remains consistent. Earth responds within limits. Flesh adapts gradually. As long as these relationships hold, intervention is unnecessary. Oversight observes, but does not interfere. Its authority lies in restraint rather than command. By the time judgment appears in the texts, that restraint has already failed. The system no longer self-regulates. Guidance has become interference. Presence amplifies instability. Distance, once protective, has collapsed. Judgment emerges because oversight can no longer remain passive without perpetuating imbalance. Observation without correction becomes negligence. Presence without separation becomes distortion. The role of oversight must change or dissolve. This is why judgment in these traditions is not framed as moral condemnation first. It is framed as response to strain. The language emphasizes decision, decree, and limitation rather than punishment. Something must be done because the system cannot continue as it is. The divine response targets scale rather than intent. Numbers are reduced. Lifespans are shortened. Boundaries are reasserted. Oversight withdraws. These measures do not correct behavior directly. They correct conditions. They slow pace. They reduce density. They restore proportion. Judgment here functions as reset, not erasure. Humanity is not eliminated. Knowledge is not removed. The world is not returned to its earlier state. Instead, constraints are introduced to prevent recurrence of unsustainable acceleration. This distinction is critical. If judgment were purely punitive, destruction would be total. Instead, it is selective. It addresses excess. The flood narrative exemplifies this logic. Water returns the world temporarily to a state of reduced differentiation. Structures dissolve, boundaries blur, activity ceases, noise disappears, the system rests. This rest is not annihilation. It is pause. When waters recede, life resumes under altered parameters. Judgment does not remove flesh from the world. It removes dominance. It reintroduces fragility. Mortality becomes central at this point. Lifespans shorten. Continuity breaks into generations rather than stretching indefinitely. This change limits accumulation of power and knowledge within single entities. Memory becomes distributed rather than concentrated. Authority fragments. Innovation slows. These are not moral punishments. They are systemic safeguards. Divine oversight transforms into judgment because oversight has become ineffective. Judgment enforces boundaries where restraint failed. The Watcher's imprisonment follows the same logic. Their removal restores distance. Oversight returns to observation by absence rather than presence. They are not destroyed because destruction would erase knowledge of consequence. They are restrained to prevent further amplification. This restraint also serves as signal. It marks the boundary that was crossed. It records consequence without annihilating memory. The texts preserve this moment with care. They do not dramatize judgment excessively. They describe it as necessary. Divine counsels appear in later retellings, but even there, debate precedes action. Judgment is not impulsive, it is deliberated. This deliberation reinforces the idea that judgment responds to conditions rather than to offense alone. Oversight evaluates system health. When imbalance exceeds tolerance, action follows. The gods are described as disturbed, not outraged. Disturbance signals dysfunction. Noise replaces rhythm. Rest becomes impossible. Rest is a key concept here. Systems require intervals of inactivity to recover. Continuous activity depletes resilience. Judgment restores rest by enforcing cessation. Floodwaters silence activity. Imprisonment halts interference. Mortality interrupts accumulation. These actions allow Earth to recover. Landscapes regenerate. Resources stabilize. Heaven remains unchanged throughout this process. Its consistency becomes reference point for correction. Judgment aligns flesh and earth back toward heaven's rhythm, rather than altering heaven to accommodate imbalance. This alignment underscores the hierarchy implicit in the worldview. Heaven defines pattern. Earth supplies medium. Flesh adapts within those constraints. When flesh exceeds its role, judgment restores alignment by limiting flesh rather than redefining heaven or earth. This logic resists modern moral framing. It does not ask whether humanity deserves punishment. It asks whether the system can continue. Judgment answers that it cannot. The texts also avoid portraying judgment as final. After correction, life resumes. Humanity continues. Knowledge persists. The story is not about condemnation. It is about survivability. This framing preserves continuity across collapse. It allows history to proceed without erasing origin. The Watcher's fate mirrors this continuity. Their presence ends, but their influence remains embedded in memory. Judgment acknowledges that some changes cannot be undone. It focuses instead on preventing further escalation. This approach reflects a deep understanding of systemic failure. Removing cause is insufficient once momentum exists. Conditions must be altered to redirect trajectory. Judgment alters conditions. Population control limits pressure. Mortality distributes knowledge across time. Absence of oversight forces internal regulation. Humanity must now develop its own restraints. Law, custom, and ethics emerge as replacements for external guidance. These replacements are imperfect. They evolve slowly. They fail often, but they are internal. Judgment thus marks a transition from externally balanced order to internally regulated existence. This transition is painful. It introduces vulnerability. It increases uncertainty. But it also enables autonomy. Humanity becomes responsible for managing its own acceleration. The divine response does not micromanage this process. It sets boundaries and withdraws. Judgment becomes less about ongoing control and more about initial recalibration. The texts describe this recalibration through symbols rather than mechanisms. Flood, imprisonment, limitation. These symbols encode functional responses to systemic overload. Understanding judgment this way dissolves the apparent contradiction between divine benevolence and destruction. The response is neither cruel nor indulgent. It is corrective. The divine role shifts from guardian to boundary setter. This shift explains why direct intervention becomes rare afterward. Oversight retreats. Humanity is left to navigate within constraints. The narrative records this retreat without nostalgia. It accepts loss of closeness as necessary. Judgment closes an era. Oversight through presence ends. Oversight through consequence begins. This change reshapes the human condition. Uncertainty replaces guidance. Responsibility replaces reassurance. The world becomes harsher, but more stable. This stability is fragile. It depends on restraint being learned rather than imposed. History that follows reflects this fragility. Cycles of growth and collapse repeat. Each repetition echoes the original pattern. Acceleration strains balance. Correction restores proportion. The story of divine oversight turning into judgment establishes this pattern as foundational. It teaches that systems fail not only through wrongdoing, but through unchecked success. Judgment intervenes when success exceeds sustainability. This lesson persists beyond myth. It reappears wherever growth outpaces structure. The ancient narrative encodes this truth without abstraction. It uses story to preserve insight. Divine oversight does not vanish entirely after judgment. It becomes background. Heaven remains reference. Earth remains constraint. Flesh acts within these parameters. The absence of constant oversight forces humanity to internalize limits. This internalization is uneven. Some societies adapt, others collapse. Judgment does not guarantee stability. It creates opportunity for rebalancing. The story does not promise harmony. It records response. The Watcher's removal and the flood do not solve all problems. They make survival possible. This modest aim reflects realism rather than idealism. Divine oversight turns into judgment because nothing else remains effective. Judgment ends not with closure but with transition. The narrative flows onward into aftermath rather than resolution. Humanity wakes into a quieter world, altered but intact. Heaven remains steady. Earth recovers slowly. Flesh learns constraint through mortality and memory. The balance is different now. It requires effort. Judgment has passed, but its imprint remains. The story continues without pause, moving toward what follows judgment rather than concluding it, carrying forward the consequences of correction into a world that must now learn to endure without the proximity it once relied upon. Samyaza's responsibility does not end with action. In many ways, it only truly begins once action has ceased. The texts that preserve his name do not linger on his words after judgment is pronounced. They do not record protests, defences, or pleas. Instead, they emphasize silence. This silence is not absence. It is weight. It is the final expression of responsibility in a system where explanation can no longer undo consequence. Responsibility in these traditions is not defined by intention alone. It is defined by outcome. Samyaza's authority among the Watchers made him visible, but visibility alone does not create guilt. What binds his name to responsibility is endurance. He remains present long enough to witness what follows from decisions that cannot be reversed. The silence attributed to Samyaza is therefore not portrayed as fear or submission. It is portrayed as recognition. The process has moved beyond debate. Judgment has been rendered not because arguments failed, but because imbalance could no longer be tolerated. At this stage, speech would not restore distance or undo transformation. Silence becomes the only form of restraint still available. In earlier moments, Samyaza speaks to coordinate, to bind, to acknowledge risk. His voice gives shape to collective awareness. But once judgment arrives, coordination loses relevance. The system responds at a scale beyond deliberation. The role of leadership dissolves not through overthrow but through redundancy. This transition from speech to silence is significant. It marks the point where responsibility is fully internalized. To argue would imply expectation of reversal. To explain would imply misunderstanding. Silence implies acceptance of consequence without resistance. The traditions do not frame Samyaza's silence as repentance in the later moral sense. There is no confession of evil intent. There is no plea for forgiveness. The silence communicates something different. It communicates acknowledgement that knowledge of risk does not equate to control over outcome. Samyaza understands that what has occurred cannot be separated into individual acts. It is systemic. It arose from conditions he helped sustain. Responsibility here is not transactional. It is structural. This understanding differentiates Samyaza from later figures cast as rebels. Rebels speak against judgment. They justify themselves. They deny legitimacy. Samyaza does none of these things. His silence affirms the legitimacy of correction even as it seals his own removal. The texts preserve this silence because it resolves ambiguity. It clarifies that the Watcher's failure was not rooted in opposition to order. It was rooted in misjudgment of scale and consequence. Silence communicates that distinction more clearly than defense ever could. There is also an implied awareness that further speech could deepen harm. Words legitimize presence. Presence amplifies influence. Silence withdraws the last remaining form of involvement that can still be controlled. In this sense, Samyaza's silence functions as final guidance. It models restraint at the point where restraint is no longer optional. The responsibility he bears is not framed as individual blame alone. It is representative. His name becomes shorthand for collective outcome. Memory requires focus. Samyaza carries that focus not because he alone acted, but because leadership concentrates consequence. This concentration of memory is not unfair within the logic of the narrative. Authority exists precisely to absorb responsibility when systems fail. Samyaza's leadership among the Watchers makes him the locus where consequence settles. The silence also reflects awareness of humanity's position. To speak might suggest that human suffering could still be negotiated away, but the narrative has already established that judgment addresses scale, not grievance. Humanity's suffering is not collateral to argument. It is part of correction. Samyaza's silence acknowledges this reality. It does not contest the necessity of reduction. It does not deny the strain humanity placed on the system. It does not deny the Watcher's role in accelerating that strain. The silence is therefore not passive. It is active restraint. It prevents further distortion at the moment when any additional influence would compound imbalance. This restraint contrasts sharply with earlier involvement. At the beginning, the Watchers intervene because silence feels irresponsible. At the end, silence becomes the only responsible option left. This inversion underscores the central lesson of the narrative. Responsibility changes form as systems change. What is appropriate at one scale becomes harmful at another. Samyaza's responsibility is also temporal. He bears knowledge of before and after. He remembers the world as it was when balance held more easily. He witnesses the world as it collapses under acceleration. His silence bridges these states without attempting to reconcile them. The texts do not grant him redemption through action. They grant him continuity through memory. His name persists not because he triumphs, but because he remains accountable. This persistence is not punishment alone. It is instruction. Samyaza's silence teaches without teaching. It demonstrates that some outcomes require acceptance rather than explanation. The imprisonment that follows reinforces this theme. Samyaza is not erased. Erasure would remove memory of consequence. He is restrained so that his silence endures. Restraint preserves awareness without permitting influence. This is consistent with the system's corrective logic. Distance restores balance. Memory preserves lesson. The silence also prevents reinterpretation. Words invite reframing. Silence limits narrative drift. The texts resist turning Samyaza into either villain or martyr. He remains unresolved, held in suspension. This unresolved state mirrors the unresolved nature of humanity's inheritance. Knowledge remains. Consequence persists. Balance is restored imperfectly. Samyaza's silence parallels humanity's new condition. Humans must now act without external guidance. They must learn restraint internally. The Watchers no longer speak. This parallel reinforces the transition from external oversight to internal regulation. Silence marks the boundary between eras. The texts do not describe Samyaza lamenting humanity's fate. Such lament would imply expectation of different outcome. The narrative avoids this. It presents consequence as necessary, not tragic in a sentimental sense. This does not mean the story lacks gravity. It carries gravity precisely because it does not soften consequence through emotional display. Silence allows gravity to remain intact. The responsibility borne by Samyaza is not alleviated by explanation, because explanation would suggest that understanding could undo harm. The narrative rejects this notion. Understanding arrives too late to prevent correction. This aligns with the broader theme that knowledge without restraint accelerates harm. Speech without power to reverse outcome becomes another form of interference. Samyaza's silence therefore closes the arc of involvement. It marks the final withdrawal of influence before removal becomes complete. The texts do not specify Samyaza's inner state. They do not describe remorse or defiance. This omission is intentional. It prevents moral simplification. Responsibility here is not emotional, it is structural. It does not require feeling to exist. By leaving Samyaza silent, the narrative forces attention away from personality and towards system. It refuses to personalize failure excessively. This refusal preserves the lesson. The problem was not one being, it was imbalance sustained by many. Samyaza's silence acknowledges this without dispersing responsibility entirely. He stands as representative, not scapegoat. The silence also preserves dignity. He does not plead, he does not justify. He accepts removal as corrective. This dignity complicates later portrayals that cast him as either villain or fallen hero. The earliest framing resists both extremes. Silence becomes the most accurate response to irreversible consequence. As judgment unfolds, Samyaza's voice fades, not because he has nothing to say, but because nothing he says can alter what must occur. The system moves beyond speech. Correction proceeds. The silence marks the end of negotiation between oversight and outcome. Humanity, watching only the effects and not the deliberations, inherits a world quieter, smaller, and more constrained. The Watchers recede fully. Guidance ends. Memory remains. Samyaza's responsibility is therefore complete, not when judgment begins, but when silence is maintained. This silence does not absolve him. It defines him. His name persists not because of what he taught, but because of what he stopped doing. The narrative flows onward from this silence without pause. Removal follows. Distance is restored. What remains is aftermath rather than resolution. Humanity continues within new limits. Knowledge persists without guidance. Balance returns unevenly. Samyaza does not reappear to correct, explain, or intervene. His silence holds. That silence becomes part of the world's structure, as important as the knowledge that once disrupted it. From here, the story moves deeper into consequence. Imprisonment replaces presence. Memory replaces instruction. The voice that once coordinated now does nothing. And in doing nothing, it allows the system to settle. This is not redemption. It is containment. Samyaza's responsibility and silence close one phase of the narrative and open another, not through declaration, but through withdrawal. The world continues, altered and constrained, carrying forward both the knowledge that changed it and the silence that followed when change exceeded control. The response to Samyaza and the Watchers does not culminate in annihilation. This absence of destruction is deliberate, and it reveals how the earliest traditions understood correction. What follows judgment is not erasure, but containment. The Watchers are removed from circulation, not eliminated from existence. They are placed beneath the earth, separated rather than destroyed, held rather than undone. This distinction matters because destruction would imply moral purification, a cleansing of corruption through elimination. Imprisonment implies something else entirely. It implies that the problem is not existence, but proximity. Not being, but influence. The Watchers are not eliminated because what they represent cannot be undone. Their actions have already altered the world, knowledge has already spread, trajectories have already shifted. Destruction would offer symbolic closure, but it would resolve nothing structurally. The system does not require absence of memory. It requires absence of further amplification. The earliest descriptions of imprisonment emphasize depth, distance, and immobility. Beneath the earth is not chosen as a place of torment alone. It is chosen as a place beyond interaction. It removes sight, voice, and presence from the realm of living systems. What is placed there no longer participates. This choice reflects restraint rather than vengeance. The Watchers are not punished to satisfy outrage. They are restrained to prevent continuation. The earth itself becomes boundary. Flesh moves upon it. Heaven arches above it. Beneath it lies what must no longer influence either. The triadic balance is restored through separation. Imprisonment beneath the earth also preserves hierarchy without rewriting it. Heaven does not collapse. Earth does not ascend. Flesh does not transcend. Each domain returns to defined limits. The Watcher's confinement signals that oversight through presence has ended. Oversight through consequence remains. Their memory persists as warning rather than guidance. The texts avoid describing pain in detail. They do not revel in suffering. They focus on restraint. Chains, pits, darkness, and depth function symbolically as removal from circulation rather than as instruments of cruelty. This restraint aligns with the broader logic of judgment throughout the narrative. The response is proportional. Excess is limited. Scale is reduced. Influence is withdrawn. Imprisonment acknowledges that some failures cannot be corrected through reversal. Once knowledge exists, it cannot be removed without erasing humanity itself. The solution must therefore prevent further escalation rather than undo past action. The Watcher's imprisonment also protects humanity. Their continued presence, even in diminished form, would perpetuate dependence. Humanity must now adapt internally. The texts preserve this necessity without dramatization. There is no rescue attempt, no appeal, no reversal. The boundary is fixed. Beneath the earth also functions as temporal suspension. The Watchers are not destroyed because destruction would end their story. Imprisonment keeps their story unresolved, held outside time rather than concluded. This unresolved state mirrors humanity's inheritance. Knowledge persists without resolution. Consequence continues without final judgment. The Watcher's restraint prevents recurrence of the same pattern. Their imprisonment ensures that acceleration will not be repeated from the same source. It also establishes precedent. Systems respond to imbalance through containment rather than annihilation. Correction preserves memory. Memory matters because it informs restraint. Erasure invites repetition. Containment warns. The earth becomes archive as well as boundary. What lies beneath is remembered even when unseen. The imprisonment also removes ambiguity about responsibility. The Watchers are restrained because oversight failed. Humanity survives because adaptation remains possible. This distinction reinforces the narrative's consistent logic. Correction targets the source of amplification, not the recipients of knowledge. The Watchers are not blamed for existence. They are restrained for continued presence. This approach preserves continuity. Heaven remains stable. Earth remains medium. Flesh remains adaptive. The Watcher's imprisonment allows the system to reset without collapsing into absence. Later traditions often reinterpret this imprisonment as eternal torment, but the earliest framing emphasizes duration rather than pain. The Watchers are held until a time when their release no longer threatens balance. This conditional framing suggests that imprisonment is functional, not purely punitive. It serves system health rather than emotional satisfaction. The depth beneath the earth also reinforces distance. It prevents communication. Silence becomes enforced rather than chosen. This enforced silence completes the withdrawal, begun voluntarily by Samyaza. Responsibility ends in separation. The Watchers do not resist imprisonment in the narrative. Resistance would imply refusal of correction. Their acceptance reinforces legitimacy of judgment. The absence of struggle preserves dignity and clarity. The system corrects. Participants submit. This submission is not portrayed as defeat. It is portrayed as conclusion of involvement. The imprisonment beneath the earth also prevents reinterpretation of the Watchers as ongoing guides. Their absence is absolute. Humanity cannot consult them. This absence forces innovation of internal regulation. Law, custom, and memory replace presence. The narrative shifts focus from divine action to human adaptation. The earth itself bears the mark of this shift. With reduced pressure, recovery begins, landscapes stabilize, cycles resume. Heaven remains unchanged, but its distance becomes more apparent. It no longer intervenes through intermediaries. Humanity enters an era defined by limitation rather than guidance. The Watcher's imprisonment marks the final severing of proximity. This severing does not erase consequence. It enforces boundary. The system continues with scars rather than wounds. Imprisonment rather than destruction ensures that the story remains instructive rather than terminal. The Watcher's fate warns without erasing the conditions that produced failure. Humanity is left with knowledge and mortality. Oversight withdraws. The world becomes quieter, smaller, and more constrained. This constraint allows survival, not perfection. The narrative does not suggest that imprisonment resolves all imbalance. It prevents further escalation. The Watchers remain beneath the earth. Removed from circulation, their influence contained. Their silence becomes permanent. The earth closes over them not to bury memory, but to seal boundary. From this point forward, humanity must learn to govern growth without external correction. The story continues not toward restoration of the past, but toward endurance within new limits. Imprisonment beneath the earth marks the end of one era and the beginning of another, not through destruction, but through separation. Nothing is undone. Nothing is erased. What remains is consequence held in place, allowing the world above to continue adapting under altered conditions. The narrative flows onward from this containment without pause, moving toward legacy rather than resolution, carrying the imprint of restraint into everything that follows. The Watchers are remembered precisely because erasure would have solved nothing. In the logic of the oldest traditions, forgetting is not correction. It is repetition waiting to happen. What is erased leaves no boundary behind, no signal that a limit was crossed, no trace of consequence. Memory, by contrast, preserves proportion. It keeps failure visible without allowing it to continue. From the beginning of the narrative, the response to imbalance consistently avoids total removal. Humanity is not destroyed. Knowledge is not revoked. Even the Watchers themselves are not annihilated. They are restrained, separated, and remembered. This pattern reveals a worldview in which continuity matters more than purity, and instruction matters more than closure. To erase the Watchers would have been to pretend that acceleration never occurred. It would suggest that the world could return to an earlier equilibrium untouched by consequence. The texts do not allow this illusion. They insist that change, once initiated, reshapes everything that follows. Memory becomes the only mechanism capable of holding that truth intact. The Watchers are remembered because they mark the first visible boundary between growth and collapse. They embody the moment when oversight failed, not through defiance, but through proximity. Their story encodes the danger of uncontained guidance more clearly than abstract law ever could. In this sense, memory functions as restraint. It does not prevent knowledge from existing, it prevents ignorance of cost. The earliest traditions do not preserve the Watchers as ongoing actors. They do not grant them continued agency. They do not allow them to intervene after imprisonment. Memory replaces presence. This replacement is intentional. Presence distorts systems. Memory instructs without interfering. The Watchers are remembered as caution rather than authority. Their names do not command obedience. They signal consequence. This distinction matters. Authority invites reliance. Caution invites reflection. By remembering the Watchers, humanity retains awareness that some thresholds, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. Knowledge accelerates systems. Presence reshapes autonomy. Oversight can become liability. Erasure would remove this awareness. It would imply that intervention carries no lasting imprint. The texts resist that implication at every turn. The Watchers are remembered not because they succeeded, but because they failed in a specific way. Their failure was systemic, not personal. It revealed structural vulnerability rather than moral corruption. Memory preserves structure better than judgment alone. The narrative also avoids demonization. Demonization simplifies memory into fear. Fear fades. Nuance endures. By preserving the Watchers as complex figures rather than monsters, the texts ensure that their story remains relevant across contexts. Their failure cannot be dismissed as alien or unnatural. It is rooted in misjudgment that any system might repeat under similar conditions. This universality is crucial. The Watchers are not erased because their story is not exceptional. It is exemplary. They illustrate what happens when capability outruns restraint, when guidance lacks exit, when proximity erodes boundary. These patterns recur whenever systems accelerate. Memory ensures recognition. The Watchers are remembered because the world that follows requires reference points. Humanity must navigate knowledge without external oversight. To do so, it needs reminders of what unregulated acceleration can produce. The Nephilim serve one such reminder. The Flood serves another. The Watchers themselves provide continuity between cause and correction. Their imprisonment beneath the earth does not remove them from memory. It anchors memory spatially. Beneath becomes archive. Depth becomes boundary. This spatial symbolism reinforces restraint. What lies beneath is known but unreachable. It cannot guide, but it cannot be forgotten either. The texts consistently treat memory as stabilizing force. Genealogies record lineage to maintain continuity. Flood narratives mark boundaries in time. Laws encode lessons learned from collapse. The Watchers fit within this framework. They are preserved as narrative anchors. Their memory also prevents reinterpretation of collapse as arbitrary. It establishes causality. Acceleration led to imbalance. Imbalance required correction. Correction imposed limits. Without the Watchers, this chain would fracture. Collapse would appear unmotivated. Judgment would seem unjust. Memory restores coherence. The Watchers are not erased because erasure would sever consequence from cause. Later traditions often attempt to resolve discomfort by intensifying blame or moralizing intent. They turn Watchers into rebels or demons to simplify narrative tension. But the earliest layers resist this simplification. They keep the Watchers ambiguous, restrained, and silent. Their memory remains instructive rather than punitive. This restraint preserves depth. It allows the story to function as pattern rather than verdict. The Watcher's remembrance also acknowledges that some knowledge cannot be disowned. Humanity inherits accelerated capability. To deny its origin would be dishonest. Memory holds humanity accountable to its own trajectory. This accountability is not punitive. It is orienting. By remembering the Watchers, humanity remembers that guidance can fail, that oversight can distort, that systems can collapse under success. This memory tempers ambition. The Watchers are remembered because they embody a limit case. They represent the point where good intention produces catastrophic outcome. This lesson cannot be encoded through abstract prohibition alone. It requires story. Story binds lesson to experience. The narrative ensures that the watcher's memory does not dominate daily life. They do not become objects of worship or consultation. They remain background. This background presence mirrors how structural knowledge operates. It shapes behavior indirectly. The watcher's absence from active roles reinforces this function. Memory does not instruct explicitly. It frames expectation. Humanity moves forward carrying awareness of prior collapse without direct reminder at every step. This allows adaptation without paralysis. The watchers are also remembered because their fate demonstrates that systems respond to imbalance through containment, not annihilation. This principle shapes later legal and ethical structures. Punishment limits influence. It does not erase existence. Exile replaces execution. Imprisonment replaces destruction. These patterns echo the Watcher's treatment. Memory of the Watchers thus informs governance as well as myth. The story suggests that restraint works better than eradication. Correction preserves continuity. The Watchers are remembered because continuity matters. The world that follows judgment is not new. It is altered. It carries scars. Memory acknowledges scars rather than hiding them. Erasure would suggest healing without scar. The texts reject this. The Watcher's story remains unfinished in a sense. Their imprisonment is indefinite. Release is conditional. Memory remains open-ended. This openness mirrors the ongoing nature of human adaptation. There is no final resolution to acceleration. Each era faces its own thresholds. Memory keeps the pattern visible. The Watchers are remembered because forgetting would invite repetition without awareness. Their story remains as warning embedded within origin narrative. This embedded warning functions across time. Each new acceleration resonates with the old one. Technology replaces metallurgy. Administration replaces writing. Systems repeat pattern. The Watcher's memory does not stop acceleration. It contextualizes it. Context allows restraint. The texts preserve the Watchers because they understood that systems do not fail once. They fail repeatedly. Memory is the only mechanism capable of linking cycles. The Watchers are not erased because erasure would break the chain of understanding. Their silence after judgment reinforces this. They do not reinterpret their failure. They do not justify. They do not instruct. Memory stands without commentary. This silence prevents distortion. It prevents later generations from using the Watchers as tools of authority. They cannot be invoked to justify expansion. They serve only as reminder of consequence. The Watchers are remembered, not erased, because they occupy a precise narrative role. They mark the boundary between guidance and interference, between growth and collapse. Their memory stabilizes the story. Without them, the narrative would lose coherence. Acceleration would appear spontaneous. Correction arbitrary. Memory preserves causality. This causality grounds responsibility. Humanity is not blamed for knowledge. It is responsible for managing it. The Watcher's story reinforces that responsibility emerges once external oversight withdraws. The memory of the Watchers is therefore not condemnation. It is inheritance. Humanity inherits knowledge and memory together. One without the other would be dangerous. The texts ensure they remain paired. The Watchers fade from presence, but not from awareness. Their names persist in margins, fragments, and warnings. They do not dominate tradition. They anchor it. This anchoring allows the narrative to continue without needing to repeat catastrophe in full. Memory reduces scale of repetition. The Watchers are remembered because they demonstrate that systems correct through separation rather than annihilation. This principle echoes through later myths, laws, and institutions. Boundaries are restored, influence is limited, memory remains. The Watcher's story does not end with their imprisonment. It continues through absence. Their absence shapes behavior. humanity learns to govern without them. This learning is uneven, slow, and imperfect. Memory of the Watchers remains a silent witness to both failure and survival. They are remembered because forgetting would imply that survival came without cost. The narrative refuses that implication. Survival is possible because cost was paid. Memory ensures that cost is not hidden. The Watchers are remembered because their story completes the arc of acceleration, correction, and adaptation. Erasure would leave only effect without cause. The texts choose coherence over comfort. They preserve memory even when it complicates belief. This choice reflects maturity. The Watchers are remembered not to be feared, worshipped, or consulted. They are remembered to be understood. Understanding limits repetition. This is the deepest function of their memory. The narrative flows onward from this remembrance into legacy. Humanity continues with knowledge and memory intertwined. The Watchers remain beneath the earth, restrained, silent, and remembered. Their presence no longer shapes the world directly. Their memory does. And through that memory, the balance between growth and restraint remains visible, not as command, but as reminder, carried forward into everything that follows, without conclusion, without erasure. As the world continues adapting under limits it must now maintain from within. What humanity inherited after the Watchers were gone was not a single gift, nor a single wound. It was a condition, a way of existing shaped by acceleration that could no longer be guided from outside, only managed from within. The absence of the Watchers did not restore the world to an earlier simplicity. It forced humanity to live with what had already been received, without explanation, without supervision, and without the possibility of return. The most immediate inheritance was knowledge itself, stripped of context. Techniques remained, skills persisted, structures continued to function. But the voice that once framed their use was gone. Humanity retained the ability to shape metal, measure land, organize labor, and record obligation, but no longer possessed an external reference for restraint. Knowledge became autonomous. This autonomy altered how knowledge functioned. What had once been instruction became tradition. What had been taught became assumed. Over generations, origin faded. Use remained. Humanity no longer asked why certain practices existed. It simply inherited them as facts of life. This shift mattered. Knowledge without origin becomes difficult to question. It appears inevitable rather than chosen. Systems solidify around it. Human societies reorganize themselves around inherited capability. Cities persisted because they could. Hierarchies hardened because tools allowed them to. Warfare continued because metallurgy made it efficient. Administration expanded because writing enabled distance. These developments were not directed by the Watchers' absence. They were enabled by their legacy. Another inheritance was imbalance embedded into structure. Acceleration had reshaped human systems faster than ethics could mature. When guidance withdrew, those systems did not dissolve. They continued operating with uneven restraint. This created a pattern that would repeat throughout history. Capability would outpace regulation. Power would concentrate before accountability could form. Collapse would follow. Recovery would rebuild within limits, only to accelerate again. This cyclical instability becomes part of the human condition. Humanity also inherited mortality as regulator. Lifespans shortened. Knowledge fragmented across generations. No single individual could accumulate enough experience to dominate indefinitely. Memory became distributed. This distribution slowed acceleration without stopping it. Progress continued but unevenly. Some knowledge was lost, some rediscovered. Innovation became episodic rather than continuous. Mortality introduced humility into systems that had previously expanded without natural breaks. It limited scale. But mortality also introduced anxiety. Without long continuity, humanity became preoccupied with legacy, permanence, and control. Structures were built to outlast individuals. Institutions replaced presence. This drive toward permanence intensified extraction and organization. Humanity sought stability through architecture, law, and ritual. These substitutes for oversight worked imperfectly. Law constrained behavior, but could be bent. Tradition preserved restraint, but could erode. Ethics developed slowly, often after damage had already occurred. Humanity inherited responsibility without instruction. This responsibility was heavy. The absence of the Watchers also changed how humans understood the unseen. With direct presence gone, the divine became distant. Heaven remained, but no longer spoke through intermediaries. This distance reshaped belief. Gods became abstract, symbolic, or localized. Worship replaced conversation. Ritual replaced instruction. Humanity filled the silence with interpretation. Some cultures framed the absence as abandonment. Others framed it as independence. Some sought to recreate proximity through ritual, sacrifice, or monument. These efforts reflect a longing for guidance rather than rebellion against its loss. The Watcher's departure did not erase the human desire for oversight. It forced that desire inward or upward into systems and symbols. Humanity inherited the habit of seeking authority beyond itself, even when such authority no longer intervened directly. This habit shaped governance. Kings claimed divine mandate. Laws invoked cosmic order. Power sought legitimacy through reference to higher principles. In this way, the Watchers' legacy influenced political imagination long after their absence. Humanity also inherited memory encoded as story rather than instruction. Myths preserved pattern without mechanism. They warned without explaining. The story of the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the Flood became a framework for interpreting collapse. When societies grew too large, too loud, too violent, memory resurfaced. These stories functioned as cultural breaks. They reminded communities that unchecked growth carried consequence. But memory alone could not prevent repetition. It could only contextualize it. Humanity also inherited a fractured relationship with knowledge. Curiosity intensified alongside fear. Knowledge promised power, but threatened collapse. This ambivalence persists. Some traditions embraced restraint, emphasizing balance and humility. Others embraced dominance, celebrating expansion and control. This divergence reflects unresolved tension inherited from the Watchers' era. Knowledge arrived before consensus on how to live with it. Humanity inherited inequality as structural condition. Accelerated knowledge had already concentrated power unevenly. Without oversight, these concentrations persisted. Social stratification hardened. Elites emerged. Labor became expendable. These developments were not new, but they intensified under inherited systems. Humanity also inherited resilience. Despite collapse, survival continued. Adaptation occurred. Communities rebuilt within new constraints. This resilience suggests that acceleration did not destroy humanity. It challenged it. The absence of the Watchers forced humanity to internalize oversight. Law, custom, and conscience evolved. These internal regulators were uneven, but they represented maturation. Humanity learned restraint through failure rather than guidance. The Watcher's removal thus marks the beginning of human adulthood in mythic terms. Guidance ends. Consequence teaches. This adulthood is harsh. It offers no guarantees. Humanity inherited silence as environment. The heavens no longer responded audibly. Interpretation replaced instruction. This silence required humanity to project meaning rather than receive it. Religion diversified. Philosophy emerged. Science developed. Each represents a different response to absence. Humanity also inherited the burden of authorship. Without external correction, humans became responsible for their system's outcomes. Failure could no longer be attributed solely to divine displeasure. It had to be examined structurally. This shift enabled reflection. The Watcher's legacy also appears in human fascination with forbidden knowledge. The idea that some understanding carries risk became foundational. Taboos formed. Sacred limits emerged. These limits were not always respected, but they shaped moral imagination. Humanity learned to associate unchecked power with collapse. This association influenced ethics, even when violated. The Watcher's absence did not simplify the world, it complicated it. Humanity inherited complexity without instruction manual. The Nephilim vanished, but disproportion remained possible. Human institutions could become monstrous without changing biology. Empires replaced giants. The same pattern repeated at different scale. Humanity inherited the tendency to exceed limits whenever systems allowed. This tendency is not evil. It is adaptive without restraint. The Watcher's story persists because it names this tendency without condemning existence itself. Humanity also inherited uncertainty about origin. Knowledge arrived without clear provenance. This obscured responsibility. Over time, humans attributed knowledge to gods, ancestors, or nature. This attribution softened accountability. The Watcher's memory complicates this softening. It reminds humanity that knowledge can come from intervention, not destiny. This reminder challenges fatalism. Humanity inherited choice, even when constrained. The Watcher's silence after departure reinforces this. They do not return to correct. Humanity must choose restraint alone. This autonomy defines the human condition thereafter. The world that follows is not guided. It is endured. Humanity continues to build, destroy, rebuild, and reinterpret. Each cycle echoes the first acceleration. The inheritance is not static. It evolves. Some cultures emphasize harmony, others emphasize conquest. Both respond to the same legacy differently. Humanity inherited the burden of pace. Growth must be managed. This burden remains unresolved. The Watcher's absence ensures that no final authority resolves it. Humanity inherits responsibility without closure. This responsibility defines history as process rather than plan. The ancient narrative does not suggest that the Watcher's departure doomed humanity. It suggests that it forced maturation. Maturation involves error. Humanity learns through collapse. This learning is slow and costly. The inheritance of knowledge without guidance creates tension that drives innovation and disaster alike. The Watchers are gone, but the world they altered persists. Humanity lives inside systems shaped by acceleration. Each generation inherits both capability and warning. Memory of the Watchers does not prevent repetition. It contextualizes it. Humanity remains capable of exceeding limits, and capable of recognizing that it has done so. This recognition emerges too late, again and again. The narrative does not promise resolution. It records pattern. What humanity inherited long after the Watchers were gone is not blame, nor blessing, but condition. A world where growth must be restrained internally. A world where silence replaces guidance. A world where consequence teaches what instruction once attempted. The inheritance is ongoing. The story does not end here. It continues through every era that wrestles with acceleration. The Watcher's absence is permanent, but their imprint is not. Humanity moves forward carrying knowledge, memory, and responsibility together. This inheritance is heavy, but it is survivable. The world remains imperfect, but enduring. The story flows onward, not toward conclusion, but toward reflection, as humanity continues navigating what it received without choosing, learning restraint not from guidance but from consequence. Within limits it must now recognize and maintain on its own. As the story settles into its final movement, it does not arrive at a conclusion in the way modern narratives often do. There is no resolution that restores certainty, no final judgment that closes the record. Instead, There is a quiet narrowing of attention, a slowing of pace, as the long arc of consequence comes to rest in the present moment, not as an answer, but as an atmosphere. Knowledge altered humanity once, and the world that followed was not undone by correction. It was reshaped. That reshaping did not end with the withdrawal of the Watchers, nor with the disappearance of the Nephilim, nor even with the flood that reduced scale and noise. It continued forward, carried by memory, structure, and habit, embedded into how humanity learned to exist without proximity to guidance. What remains most striking in the ancient record is not catastrophe, but continuity. Humanity survives the loss of oversight. Civilization does not vanish. Instead, it adapts under constraint. Growth resumes, slower at first, then gradually accelerating again as new tools, new methods, and new forms of organization emerge. The pattern does not break, it repeats. The silence that follows the Watcher's departure becomes the defining feature of the human condition. Heaven no longer intervenes through intermediaries. Earth offers no explanation beyond resistance and yield. Flesh acts, chooses, builds, and errs within a system that no longer corrects itself externally. This silence does not imply abandonment. It implies responsibility. Without guidance, humanity learns to listen to consequence. Failure becomes instructive. Collapse becomes warning. Memory becomes substitute for presence. Law, ethics, ritual, and story emerge as attempts to preserve restraint where oversight once stood. These substitutes are imperfect. They fracture under pressure. They are reshaped by power. They erode and reform, yet they persist because they must. The ancient story does not suggest that humanity was ever meant to remain static. Change was inevitable. What the narrative emphasizes is pace. The difference between gradual transformation and compressed acceleration defines whether systems adapt or fracture. Knowledge does not simply add to humanity, it reorganizes it. Each significant increase in capability alters relationships between individuals, between communities, and between humanity and the world it inhabits. These alterations ripple outward, often invisibly at first, until imbalance becomes undeniable. The Watcher's story exists because it marks the first remembered instance of this compression. Knowledge arrived faster than restraint could form. Oversight lingered too long. Correction followed. Nothing about this pattern is limited to mythic time. It reappears whenever capability outpaces structure. Each era encounters its own version of acceleration, and each responds with varying degrees of awareness. The inheritance humanity carries is not the knowledge itself, but the tension it creates. Progress invites expansion. Expansion tests limits. Limits provoke correction. Correction restores survivability, not harmony. This cycle does not imply failure of intelligence. It reflects the complexity of systems that include agency. Human beings adapt, but not instantly. Culture lags behind invention. Ethics follow power rather than preceding it. The ancient narrative recognizes this lag without condemning it. It does not portray humanity as irredeemable. It portrays humanity as learning through consequence rather than instruction. The Watcher's silence reinforces this lesson. Once guidance withdraws, learning must come from within experience. Pain replaces explanation. Memory replaces voice. The story does not romanticize this condition. It does not suggest that autonomy is easy or that independence brings peace. It acknowledges cost. Mortality shortens perspective. Collapse scars memory. Inequality persists, yet humanity continues. What endures is not mastery but resilience. Communities rebuild. Knowledge is preserved unevenly. Some lessons are remembered. Others are forgotten and relearned through repetition. The Watchers are not needed again because the pattern has already been set. Humanity now carries both capacity and warning internally. The world no longer depends on proximity to learn restraint. It learns through failure. This does not mean that failure is desirable. It means it is instructive. The ancient texts preserve this understanding quietly without spectacle. They do not shout warning, they record pattern. As time passes, the names fade, but the structure remains. Giants are replaced by empires. Metallurgy is replaced by machines. Writing is replaced by systems that operate faster than memory. Each shift accelerates capability. Each acceleration tests balance. The silence of heaven persists. There is no return to instruction. Humanity fills this silence with meaning, ambition, fear, and hope. Some of these constructions stabilize society. Others destabilize it. The story of Samyaza and the Watchers does not ask for belief. It asks for recognition. It preserves a way of seeing history not as moral decline, but as structural challenge. Knowledge does not corrupt by itself. It magnifies what already exists. Without restraint, it amplifies imbalance. With restraint, it enables survival. The difficulty lies in forming restraint at the same pace as capability. This difficulty defines history. The ancient narrative offers no promise that balance, once restored, will hold permanently. It suggests only that correction is possible, and that survival depends on recognizing limits before they are enforced. The world that followed the Watchers learned restraint through loss. Lifespans shortened, authority fragmented, knowledge dispersed. These changes slowed acceleration but did not end it. Humanity continued forward, altered, carrying both memory and momentum. The quiet thought that emerges at the end of this long arc is not framed as challenge or warning spoken aloud. It rests beneath the surface of the story, implied rather than stated. Knowledge changes systems. It changes identity. It changes expectation. Once it does, there is no return to an earlier state. The question is not whether change occurs, but how it is absorbed. The ancient texts leave this unresolved, not because they lack answer, but because the answer cannot be given once and for all. It must be lived repeatedly. Each era inherits both capacity and responsibility. Each must discover its own thresholds. The Watchers do not return to intervene. Their absence ensures that humanity cannot defer accountability. The silence remains. In that silence, growth continues, pauses, collapses, and resumes. The story does not end with fear. It ends with continuity. Humanity remains capable of learning, even when learning is slow and costly. The knowledge that once altered the world did not destroy it. It transformed it. Transformation carries risk, but also possibility. The ancient narrative does not instruct humanity to abandon knowledge. It suggests that knowledge without restraint reshapes existence, whether one intends it or not. The responsibility lies not in refusing to know, but in learning how to live with what is known. This responsibility has no external guarantor. It rests with those who inherit the world as it is, not as it was. The Watchers are gone. The world continues. Memory remains beneath the surface, quiet, persistent, and unresolved. And in that quiet, the long story settles into rest, not as an ending, but as a pause within an ongoing pattern, leaving the world to continue under its own weight, carrying knowledge forward into the future, shaped by consequence rather than guidance, as the silence holds and the night deepens, allowing the mind to drift without urgency, within a story that does not conclude but simply continues.